All right. How's it going, everyone? Murktide fans everywhere. I've brought together an expert panel of players who will be playing Murktide at the RC. At least you guys better be playing Murktide, or one of you lied to me. But yes, so we are going to be discussing the top five matchups in Modern that you face today. If you look at the RC data from the European RC that just happened this past weekend, the top five decks made up almost 60% of the meta. I'd say this is a level of, condensing that we don't often see in Modern. It's really known as the Wild West, compared to other formats. So with that in mind, I think it's really important that you bring a strong plan for these five matchups I'm about to list to your RC if you're going to play Murktide. So the five matchups are Scam, Amulet, Yawgmoth, Rhinos, and the Mirror. And I think having a plan for those matchups is super important, but also stick around till the end. We'll kind of cover what happens if you come up against mono white soul sisters, or of course that random merfolk player that just isn't willing to put down the deck. Sorry, Nikachu. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. We have two panelists for each of these matchups, and I'm going to cover off on the Murktide matchup. So we'll get started on Rhinos. We have Snelson and Massimo. Welcome, guys. You can give yourselves a quick introduction, and then go ahead and let's get into the conversation.
Yeah, really hyped to talk about the Rhinos matchup. I think it's one of the most intricate matchup about the Murktide decks. So yeah, that's it.
And actually, Massimo, sorry, I realized that the desktop audio wasn't being captured. Just redo that intro one for everyone.
Take two. So my name is Massimo. I'm from Montreal, Canada. I won my RCQ with Murktide the week before the banning of Fury and Up the Beanstalk. So that list is no longer viable. But like I said, I'm pretty hyped to talk about the Rhinos matchup. I think it's one of the most intricate matchup about Murktide and Rhinos and stuff like that. So yeah, that's it.
Hi, my name's Snelson. I am from Connecticut, and I play basically Murktide exclusively. Um, I agree with Massimo. I think this is actually a really intricate matchup, and there's a lot of really cool pieces to talk about it. For example, Massimo, when you're playing the deck itself, what are the games that you like? What are you looking for right at the start of each match?
Do you mean just against Rhinos or the meta in general?
If against Rhinos itself, because this is going to be an open deckless tournament, so we're going to know
Mhm.
you're sitting down, you see the crashing footfalls, you know what's happening.
Yeah, okay. So there's always those, quote unquote, easy games that you go on to play turn two shredder with a bobble. It's a 2-4, and then your opponent casts their shardless on their turn. You connive again, and it's a 3-5 while you still have two mana, and then you untap on turn three with a 3-5. So those are the games that I'm looking for. But again, sometimes on the draw when you have that spell pierce, then you can cheese your opponent with it or stuff like that. What about you? What's like the type of game that you like to play against Rhinos?
So my game against Rhinos, I like being the aggressor, so I really like sticking one of my one drops pretty early, basically force them to have the answer. I also very much enjoy, like you said, kind of trying to cheese them with that spell pierce. I'll very often like try and if I don't have like the one drop, I'll try and leave my fetch lands uncracked, basically so
Hmm.
that they can't fire ice and just like tap you out of counterspell. Especially if I like to try to make them like shardless on turn three when they, especially on their own turn when they can't have force negation. Um,
Hmm.
and I if you can kind of make that happen so that you can get the counter spell and kind of cheese them that way, I think it's very important. But I find that in game one especially, it's easy to get essentially cheesed back because we just don't
Hmm.
really have a good answer for the rhinos once they've actually resolved.
Because I think it's harder to win a game if they like by turn four, five, or even six. Sometimes they're able to cast a Murktide and have a force backup or something like that. I think those games are harder to win than the one that they just go turn three, shardless, or whatever outburst. Because you can still, expressive iteration your way out of a game by drawing one or two unholy heats or casting your own Murktides. But the thing is, since then they're playing that Murktide Regents or their Force of Negation. I think it's I don't know how to explain it properly, but like I think their top decks are probably better than ours, like starting by turn 5, 6, or 7. I don't know if you agree with that.
I say I kind of enjoy getting the top deck war against them, just because we usually have a little bit more cantrips between baubles, and sometimes you'll see like a fiery islet or something in the sideboard or in the lands pile for some for our Murktide decks. I do think there are some terrifying cards, like if they ever tap 5 and they actually cast the draw 3 Lorien Revealed. I think I think that's a pretty hard one to recover from. And now that they're also playing and trying to get the Flame of Anor with the Mutavault kind of wombo combo going, um, I think if you kind of get your Shredder hit by Flame of Anor, or like say you're a little bit off kilter and you try and get you try and jam a 5/5 Murktide in and get that Flame of Anor, that's just devastating. The draw 2 and kill your 5/5. Um, so I'm really looking to try and make sure my Murktide is at least 6 plus um when I'm trying to either stabilize um because of Flame of Nora, and also Dismember. You'll see around a lot.
Do you change the way you sideboard from the play and on the draw, or is it's almost like the same cards every time?
Um, I kind of do. I kind of think it's a lot harder. I like even on the draw, I like having Ragavan, even though they have an extra 4 cards that can deal with the Ragavan of the um because of the fire and ice. Um,
hmm
but I'll probably take out a Dragon's Rage channel usually, and I actually in my sideboard I love playing a Flame Slash, um, and I find that the games post sideboard, especially with when you bring in your engineered explosives and your cluster storms, you don't really have to worry about the rhinos themselves. It's more about a game of their endurances and their
Yeah.
Murktide regions. So I find that the Dragon Rage Channeler is super dangerous because sometimes he'll just attack right into and get eaten by an endurance, and that's definitely not fun. Um, so I'll usually take out a Dragon's Rage Channeler, bring in an extra Flame Slash, just so I have an extra way to deal with a 3/4 or push through damage with a push through damage with against a subtlety or something. They hard cast one of those. But what cards are you looking to take out in your um, when you go to sideboarding?
When I go to sideboarding, I usually like to take out, the usual lightning bolts, stern scolding, spell snare, whatever, which one you're playing. I used to like to take out the subtlety, but now since they're playing, Murktide and endurance in the sideboard that they bring in, I don't know what you think about subtlety, but I think I'm gonna keep the one in the main, but leave the other one in the side in the deck box for the game too.
Um, I think that's totally reasonable. I've kind of been finding subtlety to be. I usually like to board out my subtleties. I know
hmm
a lot of deck lists going around right now have both of them. Um, I now that we're talking about it, and kind of it doesn't make sense if the games we're really losing and getting beat is with their Murktide. Um, I don't not super happy with only like if they go to cast Murktide, I have to counterspell it, and then they have to not have the force of negation or uh, mystical dispute, and then you
hmm
have to hit Otawara. So I have to have the Otawara to bounce it. So yeah, I think subtlety. I think maybe leaving it one subtlety in. I do think if the quote unquote stock list that you'll see around on Murktide on MTG Goldfish has 2 of them. I think the second one is a little bit extra. So I would agree with you, one main, maybe probably keep one in the sideboard. Um, Once you get into that mid to late game where both graveyards are pretty well stocked, you might try and start using your preordains and stuff to kind of try and find it so that you don't get cheesed out that way. But fully agree on your sideboard plan. I mean, your lightning bolts, they just don't kill anything. Spell snare and spell snare technically has targets, though not
Yeah.
you're particularly thrilled to be using it for. The uh, um, stern scoldings, get those out of here. Um, but the game, what you're really looking for is your you know, force of negations, your engineered explosives to try and wipe the board, fluster storms if you have them, um, and then if you had something like I don't know, say like a flame of Anor or something in your sideboard, would you be considering bringing something like that in?
I think a 3 mana spell that doesn't counter one of their rhinos or doesn't kill. I guess it could kill a rhino, but you're never gonna get the 2-for-1 that you really hope for. One card that I do like bringing in is the Mystical Dispute. I know nowadays some lists play it, some lists don't play it, but I usually play one in my sideboard, and like getting one of their Murktides or their Force of Negation or even sometimes the Upkeep Fire Ice, like countering that spell usually makes a big difference. So I think it's a card that not a lot of people think to bring in because they say, oh, it's never going to counter the Rhino properly. But even their Brazen Bar, sometimes they play that in the sideboard, or their Tishana's, like, I think it has so many options to counter that if you have it in the sideboard, it's almost like an obligation to put it in the main board.
Oh yeah, totally agree. It's definitely like, just super flexible spell, and worst comes to worst, you pay 3 mana to counter an endurance. Like it,
Exactly. Yeah.
but also other things that we don't usually talk about is like when you're trying to resolve your Murktide, being able to just 1 mana counter subtlety, that gets missed by your spell snares and your flusterstorms, and the mystical dispute definitely handles that very well for you.
Yeah. I had like one other question about the sideboard. If you're on the play, you see any merits to bring in like a Blood Moon or not, no Magus of the Moon because it gets killed by everything, but what about Blood Moon?
Um, so I think it's I don't know.
I know it's hard. Yeah. Yeah.
Part of me is kind of thinking that like one, they don't have very stringent mana requirements. I know they have green green for endurance and green and blue blue for subtlety, but for the most part, what their main game plan is a bunch of one red or one green pip, one green and one blue pips. And so like very often they're also trying to preserve their life total, so they'll be fetching out their basics. Um, I I also think it's one of those where like they are 3 colors, so like sometimes you're just gonna get them, but there's also gonna be plenty of times where it's like you're pretty late in the game and then you just draw Blood Moon off the top of your deck and you're just like, yeah,
Yeah.
not feeling this
That's
one.
fair. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
All right. Well,
I
that's.
mean,
I just.
yeah,
I'll
go ahead.
hop in for 1 second. On the sideboarding, I had one other question because I have a Brazen Borrower. Do you guys think I should be bringing the Brazen Borrower in? And also, I have a Force of Negation. Just because you guys didn't explicitly mention those cards, but how do you feel about both of those cards?
I
I'll
actually
go.
really sorry. I,
No, go ahead.
I'll,
Your turn
I'll
now.
go
Go.
for it. Fine. I actually really like Brazen Borrower, like we said earlier. Being able to get cheesed out by a Murktide Regent, it's just one extra answer that actually gets rid of it and counters and bounces it back to their hand, and they're not going to be as moving through their library as fast as we do, so they don't always get a chance to like recast it right away. Or if they do, it's usually small enough to be unholy heated, which is really really important. Um, and then also the 3/1 body isn't actually that small because their only flyer is going to be a subtlety. So I mean, maybe you got 2-for-1 with the subtlety with your Murktide on top of your deck or something like that, but it's still just gonna the Brace Borrow can at least trade, or it's just like a very very fast clock for what we're trying to do. Um,
Mhm.
I'll let Massimo talk about Force of Negation.
Yeah, Force of Negation is like, of course, it's a good card, but sometimes in your turn, it's quite awkward to tap out or whatever, tap 3 mana to counter their spell and let them untap and go a Shardless or Murktide. But again, if you can have a turn 2 Shredder or whatever, a turn 4 Murktide back up with a counter spell, then Force of Negation in their turn, like obviously it's a great card, but sometimes you're gonna feel like it's like strictly worse cancel or something like that. But I would bring in it, of course.
Yeah, I fully agree. I also like the Force of Negation because it allows you, especially with like the list we have on the screen right now has 3 Shredders, being able to just jam Shredder on turn 2, and then like still have the Force of Negation kind of sneaky cheesy in the background, um, to just be able to like really get them, because then you do get the Shredder trigger, which is huge, to kind of try and fix your draw a little bit. Maybe you discard a land, or maybe you have something that you're trying to just grow the Shredder to get as aggressive as possible. But also, uh, do you find that the Rhino games, especially post Cyber, they go on for a long time? Because I find that's usually the case. In which case, like the Force Negation being able to hit just like a hard counter, no, pay X amount of mana going around. It's just a hard counter. I find that personally invaluable.
Yeah, that's true. Like just countering a Flame of Vaynor that's it's going to be a 1-for-1, or sometimes they're going to have the 2-for-1 of killing a creature and drawing 2 cards. Countering that has a lot of value, and like you said, no mana restrictions or anything. So I think it's good, and I'm probably going to play one in my sideboard, to be honest. But yeah,
Cool. Well, I thought maybe we could do some sample hands, maybe a couple pre-board, a couple post-board, and just you guys could talk through those because MTGO does have this functionality. Okay, here's our first hand. Let's just
Snap
say
Snap it off.
All right. So why is this a snap keep?
So obviously, whenever you're starting with the turn 1 monkey, you're basically immediately applying pressure. I would probably be on turn 1, turning, fetch shock, slam the monkey, and then probably bobble my opponent. I'd probably try to hold that second bobble. Maybe I draw a fetch land or something, so I can kind of try and fix my draw a little bit. Either try and find a shredder on turn 2, something like that. But the spell pierces, especially having 2 of them, is just super huge. Even if they kill the shredder, even if they kill the monkey, I think you're in a really good place to kind of have the game continue on for a few turns. And you're not going to get cheesed out by a pair of early rhinos.
yeah. I mean, this hand has it all. Like maybe you can switch a bauble for an expressive iteration or something, but this is almost a perfect hand against
Yeah.
Rhinos. So
No
easy
shredder. No
start.
shredder though. No shredder though.
That's fair. That's fair.
That's fair.
On the draw, would you change your play at all? Like, would you still? I guess, yeah. Would you still do the same thing? Slam the turn 1 Ragavan, or?
My
I mean, personally, I would.
my problem with waiting for Ragavan on the draw, and the other reason why I don't think we should be trying to do the bauble trick on turn 1 ourselves here, is because even if they just shardless, on their turn, you do get to spell pierce the shardless, but you don't get to get in with the monkey, and that 1 treasure is so valuable, and it's made even more valuable being on the draw because it gives you that 1 mana, so that now you can hold up both spell pierces if you want a cantrip or something on turn 2, or if you draw like a counter spell or something, like a 2 mana spell, I would so much rather do counter spell, get that force negated, and then spell pierce on top of it, so that I can still hold that spell pierce for a turn, for maybe an extra turn, where then I can try and sneak a Murktide through or something.
All right, sure. Let's
Yeah.
do one more hand pre-board, and then we'll sideboard together and do a couple hands then. All right. So let's talk play and draw. Massimo, what would you do on the play?
On the play, I would probably keep that hand against Rhinos. Like you have those 3 lands, expressive and counterspell. Bolt, it's probably the worst card in this hand, but I would go for either trick or try to hold the bauble for a shredder and or a DRC. But I think that's an easy keep in my mind. I don't know about you, Steven, but I would keep that hand.
I definitely have to think about it. It's not starting off without like a DRC or a Ragavan or a Shredder or something is kind of like, and the Bolt is already, I don't want to say it's already a mulligan, that's kind of like a cheap cop out, but like
Mm-hmm.
you're basically looking at 3 lands, Bauble, Expressive, Counterspell for like just useful cards in this matchup. I think I might actually end up end up shipping this, knowing that I'm sitting down against Rhinos, because I do want to be a little more proactive in that. I do, because like say you do the bobble trick on yourself and you see like a Dragon's Rage channel or a Ragavan on top. Like the Ragavan's time to be really valuable has kind of already passed. It's going to be easy for them to clog up the board with even if they don't have the full endurance, or sorry, the full shardless agent, they can have endurance or something like that. So I think I'd want to be a little bit more aggressive in this, and I probably would end up shipping the sand.
That's fair. I was also thinking about, with the fetch land, the expressive, the counter spell, and the bauble, like by turn 2 or 3, you have delirium. So if you can go turn 3, expressive into unholy heat, like to stop the bleeding a little bit or things like that, it may be like reduce the reason why you would mulligan, but I would see mulliganing this on the draw as well.
On the draw,
Like
yeah.
it's pretty close.
And I'll throw out there, just because I think that people aren't super used to this yet. But if you as the viewer, you might notice this Temple of Epiphany in the bottom corner here. That's not actually Temple of Epiphany, but it's the new Surveil land that you can get with a fetch land. It's not yet on Magic Online, but it will be legal at the RC. If you're in America, I think, actually. Maybe not in the Canadian RC, unfortunately. Um, does that, I mean, that could play into this decision, right? Like, I think this hand is super borderline. I'm happy that this is what the generator came out with because it's an interesting discussion. But like, if you're able to bobble trick yourself, and then if you like the card, draw it, and then on their end step fetch and get the temple to surveil and set up your next draw, or if you don't like it, fetch, get the temple, set up that, and then also draw from the bauble. Like, I think that can almost turn borderline hands like this into more keepable. You're getting to see that extra card to start to sculpt your plan and find whatever you're missing. Um,
I do think that definitely helps it if I was on the
Mhm.
play. It's definitely 100% a consideration I would think about because you're able to see 3 extra cards, right? You basically get the bauble trick, the surveil, as well as whatever you actually end up drawing from the bauble.
mhm.
If you don't like either of those, my problem it would be is that on the draw, you're still kind of priced into this counter spell. So, like trying to leave up this counter spell so you don't get just rhinos done on 3, or um, you don't get like you're still kind of planning on using this counter spell to maybe try and stop a one of the violent outbursted rhinos on your 3rd upkeep.
Mhm.
So when they can force you.
So what I'm hearing is definitely mulligan on the draw, maybe even on the play. Massimo, how are you feeling now? Keeping in mind the temple, play draw, final answer. You don't have to go into it too much. Would you keep on the play, mulligan on the draw? What are you thinking?
Keep on the play, mulligan on the draw.
I think that that's kind of where I would sit as well. Maybe we all agree on that, but
I,
um,
I kind of just think the hands where you can just turn one monkey is like kind of what the deck really wants to do. I think that's the biggest thing on the play. Like the high end hands are just so much higher.
yeah, fair enough, fair enough. All right, let's get into sideboarding. So, are you guys in agreement? We're gonna cut the bolts and the stern scolding, or do we have any disagreement there?
Nope.
That's fair.
All right.
4 bolts turn scrolling out, and let's get the force negation, brazen borrower. Um.
Well, okay. So, how do you want to sideboard after this? Do we want the
Oh
subtlety
wow.
and force negation? What are we gonna cut?
Uh, Maybe I don't know, like unholy heat.
I could see
Not
cutting.
sure.
I don't mind cutting one unholy heat. It's not really our plan to get rid of rhinos that way. We kind of just are going to use it as a onesie twosie way
Hmm.
to remove uh way to remove like an endurance or something like that. Also, like drawing a second in holy heat if you one don't have delirium or two, um like they don't have any you don't have any good targets for it. Is
Mm-hmm.
really miserable. Um, I would
Exactly.
definitely get the force negation in the deck
Yep.
over the subtlety first. Um, as for the subtlety, I think so. Would you consider this like a play draw kind of thing, Massimo? Would you like consider maybe a DRC or something over the subtlety on the draw, or would you just kind of leave the subtlety where it's at?
Yeah, I think I would leave the subtlety where it's at, regardless of a play or draw. I guess if you're on the draw, you can maybe like remove a DRC for the subtlety, or because I don't think you can remove any counter spells. But
Correct.
yeah, I
I
don't
would
know about you. Change something from the play and the draw.
I think I would consider a DRC for on the player draw because I'm not gonna yeah, unless I have a DRC in my exact opening hand, I'm not really going to just slam the DRC in play. So I can kind of wait a turn or two, maybe get to turn 3 or 4 before playing a DRC.
Hmm.
The monkeys, I don't think we can cut because we want the monkeys in our opening hand. Like we said earlier, that's the best way to kind of break serve and break play draw. It's just to get one monkey trigger, and then it's massive.
Okay. All right. So let's see. Here's a hand on the draw. This hand just seems. I think this hand is a pretty
Yeah.
clear keep.
Snap,
So let's do
snap.
another one.
Actually,
The
Okay.
biggest thing
Okay. Snap
this one as well.
keep.
So I think the
Uh.
biggest thing you're looking for in your opening hand, especially post sideboard, is just a one mana counter Um,
Yeah.
I find I lose a lot of game ones because because we don't have very good ways to answer the rhinos if it ever resolves, and we don't actually have we have a decent amount of counter magic, but it's not like they can kind of cheese us out with a force negation. So
Mhm.
being able to just have the extra 1 mana counter magic,
Like
that's basically what I'm looking for in my opening hand a lot.
a hand like this is not going to get any better than this. Turn one creature backed up with the Flusterstorm, and either you can preordain to try to grow the DRC.
Yeah,
Like this end is a snap keep as well,
try.
regardless of player draw.
The only thing I would change is maybe a fetch land instead of
Actually, yeah,
Steam Fence, so that I could have the land in my graveyard for DRC and then not get fire iced.
yeah.
Oh, this okay. Just changed DRC for an unholy heat. Are we still keeping this?
Wait, how did you do
Uh,
that?
I don't,
Did
it was random. It was I mean, maybe the sample hand generator is bugged a little bit, but that was just random.
This is on the
I would
draw.
keep as well.
This is on the draw.
Let's
Or
say, does it matter? Player draw. This will be the last hand, and then we're gonna move on.
Um,
So what do you think?
I don't think it would. I really want to one drop on the play, but I don't think it would matter. I think actually on the play it's easier because it's easier to go Spire Bluffs preordain, try and find DRC or Monkey, and then you still have the opening for it. And then I think the Flusterstorm buys you so much time on the draw that I would probably just keep it.
Yeah, same thing for me.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, thank you guys for walking us through that Rhinos matchup. We're gonna move on to the next one, but I think that was pretty comprehensive and kind of explained a lot of the different dynamics. So let me make sure I reset the deck. Up next, let's go into Yawgmoth. So we are joined by Ben and No E to talk about the Yawgmoth matchup. I think a lot of people would say this is one of the scariest matchups for Murktide right now, ever since they added Soul Cauldron. But Ben and Noe, what's the saving grace? What are we gonna do here? First of all, let's start with Ben. You can introduce yourself, and then Noe after.
Yeah, for sure. I'm Ben. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I also qualified with Murktide, kind of just in the middle of the scam era. Excited to talk about Yogg because I find the matchup to be really, really interesting and intricate and kind of requires some walking on eggshells to navigate to a win.
Hello, everyone. My name is Noe. I'm from Rio Grande City, Texas. I qualified with Murktide on like the second week of the season, so I was able to get away from the scam meta and be living life a little bit on MTGO. And yeah, I kind of agree with Ben that the Yogg matchup is very walking on eggshells. And with the addition of Soul Cauldron, it's made it a lot more difficult, mostly because I kind of explained this to a friend the other day that Soul Cauldron is basically how I feel, in my opinion. It's a mini birthing pod that uses the graveyard, which we kind of have difficulty answering because our sideboard slots are very tight and stuff. And we don't have main deck answers to it, but we could talk about that more later on once we get to that portion.
Yeah, for sure. So
Okay,
I guess
actually, wait 1 second, guys. So I want to make sure that we get everyone in to talk, and I just realized that our amulet player has another restriction. So is it okay with you guys if we do amulet first and then go back to Yawgmoth?
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so sorry about that. All right, amulet. We're joined by Sean and Brian. You guys can now introduce yourselves. We're doing this on the fly, guys, but we will get Yawgmoth in as well. So, amulet, Sean and Brian, how's it going? Go ahead, Sean. You can introduce yourself first.
Hi everyone, my name is Sean. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and I want to thank everyone for giving me this opportunity to be part of this podcast. I qualified with Murktide in November last year, just before the bannings. And in terms of Modern, I've been playing Modern for quite some time with multiple decks. I used to be a blue-white player, but I'm playing Murktide for the RC. In terms of Yawgmoth, I felt that the matchup is now much harder to win compared to previous iterations because they play with mainboard ring and postboard defense grids. Some lists play with Khan, the Great Creator, and try to have this sort of mid-range game. And although we know that the approach is obviously to start with a threat and interaction, I feel that with these cards, now it's more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And the two questions I have with regards to the amulet matchup in terms of how to approach it is, with regards to Grazier, Arbora Grazer, do we keep Ragavans postboard? And with regards to defense grids, do we still keep in Spell Pierce? Because in the past, this used to be a creature-based matchup, and we used to take Spell Pierce out.
Yeah. All right, Brian, go ahead, introduce yourself, and respond to Sean's questions. What do you think?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm from St. John's, Newfoundland. Charles and I actually qualified at the same event in Toronto. We both top 8 of the same day 2 super qualifier for Modern. So it was nice to meet him then. I haven't played Modern in a long time, but I just came back to Magic after a long break. I probably haven't actually played since Twin was legal, maybe.
Ooh, wow.
So it's been a minute, but I saw this and I knew what I had to do pretty much right away. I think for the Ragavan question, I would leave Ragavan in, I think. And I also want to keep Spell Pierce.
Okay, and so
That's correct.
let's go off of that. Let's talk about the Arboreal Grazer dynamic, I guess. You keep Ragavan in. Maybe a card that you could consider also important in that dynamic is Lightning Bolt. How do you guys both feel about Lightning Bolt? I guess starting with Brian and then Sean.
I definitely board bolts out, but I think if the Grazer lines up with the monkey, then it is what it is. But I think it's worth it if the monkey gets in.
You cut all 4 bolts?
Yeah, I would.
Okay.
On this list on the screen, I think I would. My sideboarding would probably be bringing in.
Well, we'll get into that a little bit later.
Sure.
Let's stick with this. All right, Sean, what do you think?
I remember in the past we used to take out, just looking at my sideboard guides, we used to take out lightning bolts, leather shredders because it's slow in the matchup and some number of iterations. And because I'm taking out lightning bolts, which in game 1 can actually kill the Grazer, I'm not really sure if Ragavan should be kept or not. I'm very open to the idea of keeping Ragavan in for games 2 and 3, and very happy and keen to learn how to approach game 2 and 3 whilst keeping Ragavans in light of Grazer. But in the past I've taken out lightning. Currently, I'm taking out lightning bolts, expressive iterations, and ledger shredders to keep Ragavan in. But if they do have a turn 1 Grazer there, that will be annoying because Ragavan cannot connect.
Yeah, that is definitely annoying.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable way to approach it. I think that Ragavan is a card that I think I would probably keep in, but I am a little bit unsure about the lightning bolts. I think when you're looking for cards to cut, Sean, you mentioned Shredder and some iterations. Brian, do you agree with that, or do you like those cards?
Yeah, I'm on the same plan pretty much. I've taken out in this list. I would take out Shredders.
And why?
And sorry.
I'm just curious why. Why would you take out Shredders? Why would you maybe shave some iterations?
It feels like you're not gonna get an opportunity to iteration. I try not to let my guard down very much in that matchup. And I feel like if I'm pinched on lands, trying to find a land with an iteration, you can get caught pretty easily. And I feel like Shredder doesn't actually apply enough pressure. We're just kind of trying to get a good Murktide into play, or a couple DRCs.
Yeah. Sean, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I think in this matchup we're not going for card advantage, but rather card selection or card quality. And Preordain is, in my mind, or to me, it's like a mini expressive iteration, because in going back to the guides that you and Gonti wrote, Preordain looks for that one card, and that one card could be a moon effect, it could be a subtlety, or it could be a counter spell that we need, especially on the draw where there's a huge difference between 1 and 2 mana. So in summary, I think it's okay to cut expressive iteration because we have Preordain. We have Preordain.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point of maintaining. You still have that card selection ability to find the key cards, but looking for a more efficient way to do it because you don't want to be caught with your pants down, so to speak, against some of their more explosive draws. So hard to find time to fit that expressive iteration in when it can be a 3-4 mana commitment on your own turn, maybe. Do you guys want to talk about sideboarding or any key matchup dynamics? What are you thinking?
Do you want to go first, Sean?
Oh yes. I think it's really difficult because whilst the game plan is always to put in the threat early and to play tempo with interaction, the question therefore comes to cards like the ring and post board defense grid, because right now the deck seems to have another axis to play against Murktide, whereas in the past you could just save your counter spells and removal for Titan and the Azusa / Dryad effects, but now they have multiple ways and different sort of threats. For example, artifacts where once upon a time we keep up Pierce, we start up Pierce, but now we sort of can't. So I find it really difficult post board, and even if we moon them, if they have the ring, they can draw out of it. So I'm not really sure. I mean, obviously the approach to the matchup is still the same, but I want to hear what your experience with post board in light of having defense grid in their post board.
I haven't played too much with against defense grid amulet, but you definitely have to consider. I feel like Brotherhood End is a really good addition to the sideboard for this because it just it can really clean up like an amulet into a moon very easily. But I'm definitely trying not to let it resolve. I'm looking at Mystical Dispute. I wonder if I would bring that in if it was in the sideboard. And I also really like talking about this makes me miss a null.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, I think a null, if I did have a null, I would probably be playing it. But
yeah,
because I just don't think it really lines up anymore with Leyline Binding being way down in the meta, I don't think that you can really justify it for just this matchup alone when you look at the other
I think so too.
big matchups we have. So with what we've got here with this list, how would you sideboard? This is a really tough one, maybe the hardest one out of all of the matchups, honestly. I'm still trying to figure it out myself, so what do you guys think?
I'll see if I can go first. So I'll consider what I would bring in. So I'll bring in one subtlety, the 2 moons. So that would be 4 cards. And I would take out the Stern Scolding, 3 Shredders. So that's 4 and 4.
What was the fourth?
Next, so the 3 Shredders and the 1 Stern Scolding.
What was the 4th card you're bringing in?
Oh, the 4 cards. So Subtlety, Blood Moon, Magus of the Moon. Right, so the question is whether we bring in definitely the Brotherhood's End.
Both of them or just one?
Probably both. And I can take out 1 Expressive Iteration. And if I really want to, the 2nd Expressive Iteration for Brazen Borer. And the reason why I'm saying that is because once upon a time, Murktide used to play with Dress Down. And sometimes we want to hold up mana to counter their threat, and if they play Drogo, obviously Titan doesn't play Drogo, but if they have nothing to play on their turn 2 whilst we're going first, we can easily flash in the Brazen Borer and start clocking them, and then try to play a Delver sort of a Delver-esque deck. So this is how we board.
Would you take out the bolts?
Actually, let me think about that. If I'm taking out the bolts, I'm tempted to keep in Shredder as a threat, but then again, if I'm taking out the bolts, I can keep the Shredder just purely as threats, 4, 5, 6 in addition to Murktide, knowing that they also play with Endurance.
And how do you feel about Cast into the Fire and Force of Negation?
I think Force of Negation, actually, I would actually bring in Force of Negation as well, to think about it, because it hits defense grids.
There's a lot of cards we want.
And also Ring. Cast into the Fire, I've used it before, but usually that's when the Ring has 1 activation. And sometimes the fact that they can fog us, that's usually the turn we win. When they cast the ring, they fog us, and if we untap, we usually win by a turn. We can also bring in Cast into the Fire. If we actually bring in Cast into the Fire, in addition to the 2 force negations, we can then take out the bolts. So let me just count. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, excluding Brazen Borer. But if we include Brazen Borer, we have... we can keep in 1 expressive. Yep, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4,
I see
5,
9
6,
and 9
7,
here.
8. Oh, 9 and 9, yep, sorry, that's right, 9 and 9. I think that's how we can board, especially since we don't need EI number 3, since we have 4 preordains. So this is something that I can do. I did forget about taking out the bolt, sorry about that. But I think this 9 and 9 can work, I think.
What do you think, Brian?
I think I'm really close to this, but I do actually like Stern Scolding in the matchup. Having the opportunity to tag like a Dryad or even a Grazer can be really valuable, I've found.
So what would you do? Cut the last bolt?
I think I would leave in 1 Scolding. I might actually not board in the second Brotherhood's End as well, and I might do 2 Scoldings.
I think that those are both defensible positions. I mean, I think that from my perspective, I think Cast into the Fire is really nice, and the instant speed is nice because it interacts better with the One Ring than Brotherhood's End does. Brotherhood's End does have the possibility of sweeping up multiple amulets or like an amulet and a defense grid, which can like make it potentially a really big blowout. But it's not instant speed, doesn't interact with the One Ring very well. So pros and cons to both of those, and kind of trying to figure out if you want all 4. Do you want just the Cast into the Fires? It's tricky. I'm trying to figure that out myself.
Yeah.
And then the Stern Scolding, I think it's hit or miss. You know, it's sometimes it tags a Dryad and it feels unstoppable, but their defense grid plan can be good against that.
Yeah, big time.
One last card I wanted to ask you guys about. I think we've done a pretty good job of decomping the matchup, but I'm curious about Dress Down. It's a card that we don't have anymore. What do you think about Dress Down against Amulet? And I might push back against you a little bit, but go ahead. What do you think? Maybe Sean first.
So I'm just trying to share my screen because I used to play with Dress Down in the main board. So this was my list that I used to qualify for DRC, and it does play with a couple of off-meta cards like Archmage's Charm, and back then I was playing with Considers instead of Preordain. Back then, I think with Dress Down, it allows you to sort of semi-counter the Primeval Titan on the turn it comes down, so they get nothing, whilst you can save your counter magic for the One Ring. And usually the games that I win with Dress Down is when I have this tempo effect where I stop Titan from doing its thing for 1 turn and then win in the air. In my mind, whenever I see decks with Urza Saga, I always need to have, it tells me I need to have Dress Down in my sideboard, because one way that this decks can win is that it can just go Land Saga if we don't find an early threat and win from there. So it might be me being biased because I'm quite afraid of the card as a Saga, which is why I kept in Dress Down.
Yeah, and that's fair. My pushback before Brian gets to weigh in is, do you feel like you're losing to a Titan, or do you feel like you're losing to defense grid? How good is Dress Down against their defense grid plan? Does it do anything against the One Ring? Those are some of the current concerns I would have, because I often hear people mention Dress Down and how good it is against Amulet, but I'm not always so sure. Brian, what do you think about that?
I feel like if they're in a position where they need, you're putting them in a position where they have no choice but to try to combo, Dress Down is good. If you know that you can do that and they have to try to attack you and play a Titan or whatever, that's great. But that's not always going to be the case if they try to do this more mid-range thing that's going on lately. So I think I agree with not playing Dress Down. It doesn't have a lot of crossover with other matchups either, so I'm happy to have that slot for something more useful.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. All right, let's do a couple practice hands, and I know, Sean, you have to drop So we'll do a couple practice hands and then we'll be able to go from there. All right, so we'll start with pre-board and let's take a practice hand. So say you're on the play with this hand. How do you feel, Brian?
I love it, but I think I'm actually not. It's hard to know if you should play a threat on turn 1, but I think that I might not.
And why wouldn't you?
I really don't want them to just get an amulet because in game 1 we don't really have a way to deal with that. And if we have an opportunity to deal with that on the stack, I think that we kind of have to take it.
What do you think, Sean?
No, I agree. I agree, Brian, especially on the play because the question is, it's very, very tempting to start with Land Ragavan and hope they don't have the Amulet of Vigor or Grazer attack the next turn to get one additional mana. But now because you have to consider they have 8 of these 1-drops, so potentially you can play Steam Vents and pass the turn, or Bobble and then pass the turn to hold up mana for Spell Pierce. I think that was something that the articles did talk about. But I think at the same time, this hand allows us to deploy a threat turn 1. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough. There are reasons to keep it and reasons why this hand is not that great.
I think like you play the threat on turn 1, and like if they have a Grazer, it's bad, and if they have an amulet, it's also bad. So I just think you don't play it.
Sure, I mean
Fair
that's
enough, I
interesting.
agree.
And you always consider what types of hands your opponent is going to keep, right? So say you're on the play, they keep a hand on 7. I think it is somewhat fair to assume that their hand is going to contain an amulet or a Grazer a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And so maybe that point is worth it. I mean, if it's Grazer, I guess waiting on the threat doesn't actually improve anything, so it's really just about amulet. It's a tough call. Personally, I usually lean towards jamming the threat and making them have the amulet plus the untapped land, which can sometimes be, not the case. I guess they don't have very many tapped lands, but just like Valakut. Maybe that's not a really good point. But yeah, so I usually lean towards getting the threat down and making them have it, and Pierce can still do something against like the One Ring, but I also do see the point if you do get to tag the amulet with a Spell Pierce, that's a huge swing. So there's a lot of value there. And all right, let's do one more hand.
Yeah, I think Sean had to drop there.
Oh, okay. So
No,
if
it's okay.
Sean had to drop, that's okay. Well, you can take it, Brian.
I think this is the same kind of idea. The Scryland is interesting. I think we're probably still just playing a fetch and passing. But I'm happy to keep this on the player of the draw.
Yeah, and interestingly,
Actually,
it's kind of
great on
funny
the draw.
because if we didn't have the Scryland in hand, we could have fetched it, but now we've got it in hand. So
Yeah.
And you would keep this hand?
Yeah, I'm reconsidering my draw decision. I don't know if this is actually that great on the draw.
On the draw, yeah. Okay, I think that's fair. All right, we can do a sideboard.
Yeah.
So we're gonna take out these, bring in these, and what was the last card we were gonna cut? Was it the last
One bolt. Yeah.
All right. Let's look at a hand. All right. Say you're on the draw.
Yeah, I'm happy with this on the draw.
And what's your plan?
I'm probably bobbling myself.
I guess it depends what they do on turn 1, right? Like if they don't play an amulet, turn 1. Say they just play a land and pass. What are you gonna do?
I think it's probably safe to preordain on that circumstance because if there's an amulet coming down, it's easy to cast it. We're gonna get an extra card with Bobble. Try to find some sort of pressure, I think, or maybe
defense grid.
Yeah, that's true.
But you do have the cast into the fire, so.
Yeah. I'm happy to trade a cast for a grid. I'd much rather trade it for a ring, but the defense grid is a good point. There's a lot of merit to holding up a Pierce there.
I think you can probably totally get away with bobbling yourself. Remember, this Tarn has to get an island because of because we just boarded moon effects. So I think you can go with the bobble. bobble yourself, and then if you like it, you just leave it and draw it, or you just basically fetch an island and hold up spell pierce.
Yeah, I like that plan a lot.
Cool. All right, let's do one more hand, and Snelson is coming in to replace Sean for just because
love
Snelson
it.
has some amulet friends as well, so they're ready. They're excited to weigh in on the matchup. They've got some enemy intel. They've been infiltrating enemy lines, and I think that's always a super helpful perspective. The other day, I learned that some amulet players like to cut Urza's Saga post board just because of the threat of Blood Moon. So. And also just losing a land drop. So that can completely change how you sideboard. I mean, then all of a sudden Brotherhood's End doesn't seem as good, right? Learning those things. So what do you think about this hand, Brian?
I think this is pretty much the same.
Same hand, just second.
Yeah.
Why? Okay, it's clearly bugged. It's just 2 casts into the fire in every hand. All right, let's do another
Can we
hand.
sidebar on something really quick too?
Yeah.
Are you guys aware of the new amulet tech in Earthquake?
Earthquake? What's that?
And there's Earthquake is a card from Alpha Beta Unlimited that is it's X in red, and it deals X damage to each creature without flying and each player.
Card.
And there's also a card in the new set that is red-green X, and you put X land cards from your hand into play tapped and deal X damage to each creature. So I feel like this is probably going to be in their board.
Interesting. Is it Earthquake? I haven't heard of
that. Yeah.
Just a way to deal with Magus, and then because I've also seen people playing the Carnosaur.
The one that discovers 5. Trumpeting.
Yeah. Trumpeting
really?
Carnosaur. Yeah, they'll play Trumpeting Carnosaur, and then obviously the pitch effect on it goes to kill the works on the magnet too.
Yeah, wow.
But the green red X spell I definitely kind of expect. Do you think that there's any reason to, a lot of people are playing 3 moon effects. Do you think there's a reason to go from 1 moon 2 Magus to 2 moon 1 Magus? Like just having the 1 Magus really kind of makes them have to sideboard really hard.
Yeah.
Because obviously they have to prepare for it. It doesn't get hit by Maseju and stuff like that. Maybe we kind of go back to the other flip of 2 moon 1 Magus, so because people are bringing in, it still forces them to bring in like 10 cards.
Yeah, I think any number of Magus is good because they're going to have to dilute their plan. But I think they're always going to have access to like 3 at least Pasejus, aren't they?
Yeah, for the most part, they have 3 Pasejus. They'll also have. They usually have 2 in the main, and then sometimes you'll see the 3rd in the board. There's also what's the other? They don't bring in Force and Negation. I thought there was one more.
Pact sometimes.
Pact.
I've seen them bring in Pact Negation. Yeah.
I've actually seen Pact Negation in a little while. But that's something definitely good to know about, just because.
Yeah.
I've definitely seen the one thing is that I've definitely seen them cutting on Cavern of Souls, which we're actually thrilled about.
Yeah,
that was the card that like beat me all the time.
That's a rough one.
Yeah, but also kind of makes an argument for that subtlety isn't really as good as it used to be against them, because they don't have it, and their what's it called plan? Their Damping Sphere plan doesn't actually help. The subtlety doesn't really help against the
no, it really doesn't.
Defense grid.
Correct. Defense grid. I knew it was some 2-mana artifact.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point. Similar to Dress Down, I would have that pushback of the thing. So subtlety has always been lauded as a really important card against them, and I still think that it's pretty strong. But if their key plan comes down to defense grid, and then also the One Ring, I feel like is a card that can really be effective against us. Subtlety doesn't line up as well into those, so I see it as less valuable. I do think we gotta start to wrap up this amulet portion. Would you guys keep or mull this hand?
I'd mull this hand.
Yep, easy mull.
Yeah, just no second land, no way to dig for it. It's gonna be really slow and clunky, so tempting with the Magus, but
exactly.
What was the next card? Another Bauble classic. All right. Oh, maybe.
Oh yeah.
All right, and then one last hand.
I would probably.
I'm gonna keep that.
My problem. Are you planning? What's your plan with this hand? So you keep this hand. You obviously shock a steam fence on one, and then we're just jamming a DRC
Yeah, I'm gonna play a DRC. If we're on the play, I'm happy to clean up an amulet.
on two, and then
Yeah, I don't.
plan it just to power out this Murktide. Basically, just try and power out this Murktide as fast as possible.
Yeah, I definitely want to try to fire off this heat early if I can in this situation. Like if they played a grazer, if there's a grazer, I wanna hit it with a heat just to surveil mostly.
Correct.
But yeah, I'm just
a
happy to
little
get stuff
iffy
in the air
on
and
this
play
hand as
Murktide.
well, because like I see the benefit of you have a lot of the cards that you're kind of looking for, and there's a lot of draw steps that would definitely improve this hand. But if you like brick a draw step or two, this hand is kind of hung out to dry because it's just like you're not putting any pressure, and you're like kind of solely reacting. I guess like the hope is that you play DRC and then cast into the fire, hitting their amulet or defense grid is gonna like really like slow their plan down. But like a subtlety is not gonna do too much if you don't already have pressure going. So this hand is like it's deceptively not as good as it might seem, despite having like subtlety and cast into the fire, which are like both generally reasonable cards to have in the matchup. Even like a fetch land would help a lot, honestly, in my opinion. Just like getting closer to Murktide. Even the temple could be like something you might want to fetch up. So
one thing I wanted to say about the sideboard plan is that I usually like to leave in a few bolts against them, specifically because you guys kept bringing up how big of a problem Razor is. Basically, one, the little bit of reach is not unwelcome, of course. I wouldn't keep all four. I'd probably keep in, one or two, but I'd probably be from the sideboard you have here. I think there's a lot going on in the sideboard right now. That is good against Amulet, but I think there's a little bit of loss of value over replacement. I kind of think I would take out probably 2 bolts, an expressive, and the shredders, which is going to be a total of 6 cards. And then I'd be looking to bring in the subtlety, the moon effects, the force of negation. Basically the 6 you have pulled off to the side there.
Right.
You already, I don't really want more than 1 stern scolding because it doesn't have that many targets, but when it does go off, it's just absolutely massive.
Yeah.
Scolding might be one of the only reasons I don't cast a creature on turn 1, but I really just think you want the idiot to play. And then the other thing I like leaving in, like, I know Expressive Iteration isn't fantastic in the matchup by any means, but you bring in a bunch of pitch cards, especially with, we talked about subtlety. Most of this has the 2 subtlety mains. You have the subtlety here in the sideboard. We're bringing in the force negation. You still kind of need the cards in hand just to kind of pitch to these pitch spells to kind of get full value out of them, because them being free is super important, especially when you're dealing with the what's it called plan? The defense grid. Why can't I remember the name of that card? Especially when you're dealing with the defense grid plan, because now you're still basically paying for force negation. You're just also going to exile a card out of your hand.
yeah.
So I would definitely prefer a much smaller package for this matchup, and it also allows you to kind of move some of these cards into like just bigger hammers for other matchups. Because without them, without we talked about without Cavern of Souls, like your counter spells are now almost always live. They're a little bit strained, which is why we're bringing in the force negation and subtlety because of between Titans and rings. But I'm basically just trying to put an idiot into play and turn that thing sideways.
I appreciate that perspective. I think that's fair. I usually do leave in a couple bolts, but I think that it's also defensible to cut them. It just kind of depends on how the game ends up teetering, but I think that there's definitely a good argument to keep bolts in and keep a couple iterations in. I think everyone agrees on cutting Shredder. It's just hard to trigger and doesn't apply a lot of pressure. All right, well, we're going to keep it moving to the next matchup, but I think that gave a pretty comprehensive breakdown of Amulet. Thank you guys both, and thank you to Sean, who had to drop for that. We'll head back to Yawgmoth. So Noe and Ben, thank you guys for waiting. Appreciate your flexibility there. I just personally was afraid to talk about Yawgmoth. That's the real reason. I wanted to bring in like Amulet, which is a better matchup first before we talk about Yawgmoth, because I've just been getting my butt kicked. I don't know if you guys have seen my YouTube videos, but I played some matches. I was like 0-5 at first. Finally got a match, but what can we do? Someone help me.
Don't worry, you can go and rewatch this afterwards and learn how to win some matches against them.
Oh boy.
With that, I'll let Noe start talking.
All right. Well, I'll continue on with saying that Yawgmoth basically has a mini birthing pod now that is very difficult for us to interact with, especially when they have uncounterable spells because of Halfling. So basically, from what I've noticed with the Yawgmoth matchup is that from the Lord of the Rings set forward is when the matchup just swang into their favor. Beforehand, it didn't really feel that difficult, mostly because of the fact that we have our flying beaters that they can interact with properly, and that we have counterspell to counter their important spells. Also, Murktide is a big thing for the matchup too. But since Lord of the Rings, they've got Orcish Bowmasters, they got Delia Halfling, they also now have Act of the Soul Cauldron, which is being previewed right there. And I don't understand how this got through play design because it has too many texts and very little invest. Like, you don't have to invest so much. This is a turn two play that, all right, cool. Deal with my dorks that get +1/+1 counters, which is basically a lot of their deck, especially with Young Wolf. And where it becomes more difficult is when they flash in a Bowmaster because their mass, I think it's a mass creature. Their token comes in with the +1/+1 token. So they base that 1/1 token has the abilities of a Yogg, Grist, Halfling. Let me see, what's their Wall of Roots?
Yep.
Anything with an activated ability. Um, so basically, I would I think I could say this in confidence, like 95% confidence that game one we're a dog against them. Because Ragavan is useless, spell pierces are useless, and if we are not able the times that I found that I won game one is when we are able to do like a double Darcy play on the play, not on the draw because of Bowmasters. On the play, if we're turn two, we do like a turn two, play our second Darcy with like a bulk backup and be able to play like preordain, bauble, something along those lines, and get an early beat in with the two Delver secrets, the 3/3 flyers and stuff. We kind of have a chance until they drop Soul Cauldron. And if we don't have multiple Delirious pieces, we kind of get so far behind because even though it does eat one of our uh, graveyard pieces, it kind of just dilutes what our graveyard is over like the next 2 or 3 turns because they could just target specifically the Delirium card, the card that's giving us Delirium. So then we just our 3D flyers just become 1/1 blockers at that point. Um, and another thing is Grist. I don't know how that is a creature on the stack. So we can't counter a planeswalker with a spell pierce, which is Grist, and I think that is very difficult for us because if we don't have, if we're trying to develop our board and we try to express iteration on turn three, it is very unlikely that they don't untap with a Grist. And once they have a Grist going along with Soul Cauldron, it is just very difficult for us. But I do think it gets better games 2 and 3 because we just take out our dead cards, which are Ragavan, Spell Pierces. I've also found that trimming on Dragon's Race Chandler has helped the matchup too. I'm still trying to figure it out a little bit if I still want to keep some. But we'll talk about the sideboarding later. I don't know if you want to input
Yeah,
more,
let's
Ben.
hold on that just to let Ben give a macro view, or his macro view of the matchup. I think what I was hearing from you is the games we win game one, we have to be aggressive, right? Is kind of what it comes down to, and then kind of trying to pick and choose where we can interact as necessary with they have a whole smattering of cards that are effective. Grist, Cauldron, Bowmasters can be effective depending on the draw. But Ben, when you think about this matchup, like coming in, does it come down to a specific card, or does it come down to a specific game plan? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think like the way that the decks have been being built recently actually kind of helps to sway the matchup so it's not so drastically unfavored. Like Ledger Shredder is a card that I really really like in this matchup. It's not uncommon for the Yogg deck to want to be double spelling pretty early on, so you can that card goes a long way in kind of just making them play more awkwardly, not being able to like curve out as they usually would want to. Even though, like Noe was touching on, we have some pretty bad cards in the matchup in general that we'll go over later. But I think it's pretty obvious that like Spell Pierce is usually pretty bad against the against like the zoo type creature decks. But there's some pretty critical cards in their game plan that you can hit with it game one, and those cards that come to mind are like Agatha Soul Cauldron. Anytime you're able to Spell Pierce that thing and actually get it countered is just a ginormous win. Chord of Calling also comes up. I know if you're able to pierce a Chord of Calling, it's can also be game winning. And then the last one that not every Yoggless plays still, but Eldritch Evolution is just a great for 2-for-1 in your favor. I wanted to touch on Ragavan in game one. I know that the classic trope is that everybody thinks that the Yogg player always has the Young Wolf to block the Ragavan, and then Ragavan's useless. But I find that not every Yogg player has a Young Wolf in their opening hand, and if it's open deckless, maybe your opponent mulligans to it. But if they're mulliganing to a Young Wolf on the draw, I'm not terribly upset about it. But I think like you can really, if you can get one or two hits in with your Ragavan, or even if you force them to like block with their Wall of Roots or whatever, then you're able to convert a bolt onto a Wall of Roots. You can make some of these kind of bad situations into more winnable scenarios for yourself. So I'd say just a brief macro overview is like turn one, you want to be either dropping a dork or just having like a removal spell for their dork, and then turn two just playing a shredder or something, and then you just kind of play this mid-range deck where you have to like balance your removal spells and counter spells and just counter the critical pieces, which is Soul Cauldron, Grist, and Yogg. I think if you can deal with those three cards, you're golden, and you should be all right to just win a mid-range mirror against them.
Yeah, I think that's both of you had some pretty fair analysis. Okay, so now Noe, let's get into Dragon Rage Channeler. Those little nuances. You say I want to cut Dragon Rage Channeler sideboard. I think that's controversial. I wouldn't say I disagree necessarily, but why do you want to cut Dragon Rage Channeler? What are some of the play patterns you see? What is like kind of the bigger goal? First, are we all cutting 4 Ragavans play and draw, or are we keeping them in, Ben? What do you?
I think we get these monkeys out of our deck. They
Okay.
you can kind of maneuver your way to making them look okay, but I just don't want them against a deck that's playing Young
Sure,
Wolf
so
or
maybe
Striker
monkey
Recognize.
game 1 on the play can be serviceable, but post board, and I heard Noe loud and clear that he doesn't want them touch them with a 10-foot pole in the matchup, so I assume that he's cutting them as well.
Make a 20-foot pole.
20 foot. Okay. All right. So Ragavans are gone. We've cut 4 Ragavans. Now I'm hearing. We'll start with Noe's perspective of cut Dragon Rage Channel. Are you cutting all of them, shaving them down? What was kind of your thought process behind that? Walk me through it.
So from what I've experienced against Yogg is that they do deal with our Dragon's Race Channelers pretty well, especially when they bring in some number of endurances. Basically, their chords count for that, extra copies and such. And the other thing too is that I found that we are more successful when we become like a control plan against them. I know that you have two brotherhoods, and so um, it kind of depends on the numbers on that. If you have one brotherhood's end, I could say keep two or three Dragon Race Chandler just because you could kind of tempo or aggro them out. But since you have two and you are on the three shredders plan, I like just maybe even cutting all of them too, just so that we could become a better control deck against them. Especially since it kind of deals with Cauldron with the cast and the fires that you have. I've messed around with engineer explosives a little bit too. I'm kind of not a fan of it, but it kind of deals with Cauldron, so it's still kind of like trying to figure out the numbers on it at the moment. But I wouldn't disagree if anyone says, "Oh, keep four or cut two," things like that. It kind of depends on the numbers you're bringing in and bringing out. Um, but for sure, as I know right now, like some of the auto takeouts are Ragavans, the two spell pierces. Some might keep them in for chords. I'm kind of not a big fan of it because there's not a lot. Because chord is what, four, cauldrons are what, three, so that's seven. I don't like cauldrons a lot, mostly because halfling is a thing. So they could tap halfling to convert like a colored mana source to be able to play cauldron to make it uncounterable. So it
Well,
kind
we
of
might have bigger problems if their halfling sticks around, but
yeah, 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 exactly. Like it's just like those little things of like the micro plays of it. Um, so it basically comes down to what the player has in their boards. I know your board. I would bring in a lot actually. So it would be the two brotherhoods and stern scoldings. Stern scoldings are like a slam dunk on this matchup too. Uh, Subtlety for sure. Subtlety I would bring in. Cast into the fire. I've liked one. I don't know about two. I've liked one because it deals with Cauldron. Um, and also, if they're playing ignorable hierarchs, like I know some lists are running like maybe two or three of the 0/1 or 1/1 mana dorks. So you could kind of get lucky. It also deals with Bowmaster. So you could bring in possibly two. And then another thing that I'm trying to fiddle with is if Blood Moon is worth it. Um, because I know we try to kill their mana dorks so that way we could decelerate them. And what I've noticed a lot in my matchups against some Yogg players is that they kind of don't go for the basics anymore. I don't know why. I guess they kind of don't respect Blood Moon anymore. So it kind of depends on that. If you notice game one, the Yawgmoth player is fetching their basics a lot. If they are, I wouldn't bring it in. Um, if they aren't, I would bring it in just to try to get the oh gotcha aspect of it.
yeah.
And if you're indecisive about Blood Moon, I would just bring in maybe the engineer explosives to help deal. Because there are times that their board just becomes a bunch of one drops too, or a bunch of wall roots. So getting rid of wall roots with Cauldron sounds nice. So it kind of depends how you're feeling at that point, I think. But yeah, it's something around those numbers. Maybe play around with one. I don't see a cursed tome, right? Okay, so yeah, I would probably just bring in the EE. I wouldn't bring in Magus mostly because it dies to Yawgmoth and it dies to Gris, so you kind of want to avoid those things.
Sure. I mean, if the Yawgmoth Aggress is in play, also maybe have problems, but could come up, I guess. And then you said maybe an E. Okay, Ben, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I like some of these suggestions. Some of them I think are cute. For me, I don't think unless I see on my opponent's like deck list they're on like 4 endurance, maybe then I cut the Chandler. But I tend to value Chandler very, very highly in this matchup. I think an early Chandler plus like some stern scoldings, and you just want to clock them as quick as you can, because I think if you give them enough time, you're gonna just run out of counter spells or removal spells, and they're gonna kind of be able to out mid range you. So I think we really want to approach this from a like a tempo style type of thing, which is the most made up word of all time, but you just wanna get the ball rolling early, and I think you kind of want to keep it rolling in your favor. I think as soon as we touched on this earlier, but like playing from an even board state versus playing behind with this deck is very significant difference in like your win percentage. So for me, I think I'm actually like pretty low on the amount of cards I would take out. I think the Ragavans are bad, and I think the Pierces are bad. I echo Noe on that. There's just not a ton of great targets for it. And I think what I'm boarding in here is I like the Stern Scoldings out of the board. I like the subtlety. I actually really enjoy Brazen Borrower in the matchup. I think you can like bouncing a Cauldron or bouncing a Dork or bouncing a Yawg, or it feels like there's a lot of utility, and it just adds on to that like you're able to fly over all of their dudes on the ground and get them to a low life total very quickly. And then once you get them to a low life total, they're not actually going to be able to use Yogg all that much, because then they're facing the threat of, oh well, he's only used one lightning bolt this game. There's 3 more potentially. And then the last 2 cards I would bring in probably both the Cast into the Fires. I've been overly impressed with that card, both for its ability to get rid of a Soul Cauldron, and for getting rid of, it's just a clean answer to Bowmasters. So I think that's probably just how I would board in this matchup. Not the biggest fan of Brotherhood's End into the matchup, just because it seems like so many of their creatures are recursion based, and the fact that it makes you choose between getting rid of a Cauldron or dealing 3 to all creatures, I could see a world where it gets awkward if you play like a Shredder on 2, and then like your opponent goes wide and you have to use it, and like it sweeps up your own Shredder or like a DRC or something. I think it's a little too awkward. So I think this is kind of how I would board, and yeah.
I think both are pretty reasonable approaches. I mean, I have to say that I've been messing around with a lot. I would consider maybe these 5 core cards to me. I think Cast into the Fire is just, it's so important because of the fact that it hits Cauldron, and just like, especially in situations where it slips through, if you don't have a core density of answers to Cauldron, you're like kind of doomed. To the point where I almost consider the Brotherhood's End, with the primary focus being like just having answers to Cauldron, but also with a little bit of flexibility. And then Stern Scolding, it's just like unparalleled efficiency. It makes it so that it's really hard for the Yawgmoth player to actually kill you by like putting Yawgmoth or Grist on the stack, and usually they're like killing you by like Soul Cauldroning it or courting for it. But I like at least narrowing their range of cards that can really punish you. So it's not a perfect card, but it makes them more reliant on Court of Calling and Cauldron, which I think is the best we can kind of do. I've messed around with Blood Moon. I think you can try to moon them on the play. I think that it often does work if they're not expecting it, but also they just like it. Blood Moon always locks them off of Yawgmoth, expecting that Halfling is not sticking around, because if it does, you're in a lot of trouble. Right, yeah. And it locks them off Grist a lot too, just because it's like hard for them to fetch a forest and a swamp. Fetching the swamp is especially awkward early on, so like, or if they fetch the swamp, they often won't have the forest. It's usually one or the other. So I see some value in the moons. I kind of like, the way I would think about it is like, how desperate are we, basically? So I think that the matchup can get kind of desperate, so I might be more likely to try to do like a play that's a little more volatile and cheesy, I guess you could say. But it is kind of tricky, like what to cut from this list. Like DRC is the card that I guess you could cut. Pushing back on Ben and your perspective of like getting the DRC down early and pressuring them, what I've found is, especially on the draw, I'll say to start, is it's awkward. Like it's awkward because you can't play DRC turn 1 because first of all, they could have a Halfling and you have to kill it. But second of all, they have Bowmasters, right? And then even on turn 2, if you're on the draw, if they pass with Bowmasters up it can be a little bit awkward to play DRC and then have to counter the Bowmasters, and then they can like untap and grist you or endurance you or do like something else. And I guess maybe the truth is you're not like super afraid of grist if you already have the DRC in play, but I've just felt DRC used to be phenomenal, and I would have rated it as like our second best card in the old days where we had like DRC and Murktide were the two best cards. But now I think Bowmasters changed the dynamic, and Soul Cauldron to an extent too makes you want to be more reactive, where I would almost question like, do you want the Spell Pierces in just to have more outs, not be so cold to that card? So those are all questions that I ask myself when I'm talking about the matchup. I guess you guys, I'll give you a chance to respond before we go into some example hands.
Yeah.
go ahead,
go
go ahead.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I would say there is that kind of like cat and mouse game on the DRCs and Bowmasters, but I think it's important to remember like they kind of have to, just as we kind of play at like we have to try to play around Bowmasters, they at the same time kind of have to be more aware of like, we have Stern Scolding, or like I don't think it's so straightforward as to like, well, they have Bowmasters so we can't play out our DRC super on, because maybe Bowmasters is like just not the optimal play for them. So I think sometimes like forcing that line, or maybe like say you even have like a subtlety in hand and you like you 2-for-1 yourself, but you're effectively time walking, and then maybe you're able to like turn on Delirium for your DRC. I see a lot of like more scenarios where it's like you can kind of just screw up how their turns look for their turn 2 and 3, even on the draw with DRC. So I guess that's kind of the pushback I would give on your take on it.
Yeah, fair. Anything to add, Noe?
Yeah, I do want to add, when it comes to playing Darcy, especially on the draw, I still do not think you should be playing it on turn 1, mostly because Bowmaster is a real thing. And going draw turn 1, play Darcy, unless you have like 3 baubles and you could hit Delirium off of that, then I mean, go for it. Like if it's in that, like if you have like Fetch Land, Darcy, 3 baubles, and you want to high roll it, you go for it. Like I wouldn't disagree on it. I'd probably make that play too, just because of the early pressure. That's mostly why I've been kind of off Darcy when it comes to the Yawg matchup, because how Twin was saying was that it does get awkward. It gets very awkward because you kind of want to keep up your permission spells. You want to use your bolts. So I think it's more efficient. Like maybe Darcy is a better play in turns 3 and 4. Once we're out of their aggro mid-range plan, where we're trying to just make sure that we slow them down, because by then we should probably have Delirium at that point. I won't guarantee it because variance is the thing for sure. When you brought up Spell Pierce, and I remember I was seeing the RC Ghent. Arnie was playing against Yawgmoth, and he kept in Spell Pierce, and I was thinking about it. Maybe we do want some numbers, especially on the draw. Maybe just to get rid of that cauldron, try to be cheeky with it, because our matchup it does get more difficult against them. So I don't know. I mean, it's still numbers that I'm trying to play with. In testing too, but
yeah, I think what I'm hearing is sorry to cut you off, but it sounds like you're wishy-washy on DRC. I think what I'm hearing is we all agree, you have to respect Bowmaster to an extent, and Ben is kind of saying like, don't play it on turn 1. I agree with you. No, we definitely don't do that. But like use it as a 1-mana spell that is still able to like be efficient and kind of make their things awkward, and then once it starts applying pressure, that's really valuable. I also think it's worth bringing up that like DRC, that surveil value can help you stick in the game longer in the middle game. So I mean the card serves a lot of purposes and is just generally a really fantastic card. So despite all of its shortcomings, that's still why I think it's like hard to cut it and why I think it might not be correct to cut it, even though there's like a million reasons. You could say Soul Cauldron pressures your graveyard too. Well, then you're kind of in trouble because Soul Cauldron resolved. But still, there's a lot of reasons to not cut it, but equally, there's still a lot of reasons to cut it. I think it's a tricky one. On the play, I'm definitely keeping them personally, but on the draw, I'm a little tempted by the Spell Pierces and just trying to like tag a Cauldron, keep their board clean, play more controlling role, or tag a Court of Calling later on. I think Shredder is great at helping to apply pressure even with the absence of DRC, but maybe you want both. Let's do some sample hands, just to see how things kind of play out. All right, I think we're not going to keep a no-lander. All right, let's say we're on the play. I think that's what it is. What would you keep or mulligan?
I can go first. I think I'm snap keeping this hand. I think the value of Ragavan on 1, it just puts them onto you. They either have to have one of their 4 young wolves, and then if they don't have that, then I think this hand like can take off to the races. You have a Preordain to follow up, so and a Bobble, so you're pretty secure on your second land, and then you have like a Pierce to deal with the Cauldron. I really like this hand. I think I'm keeping it every time on the play.
On the play, I could see merit about keeping it, and Ben, you did a good job explaining it. But I personally like I aggressively mulligan. Because I'm thinking about it. Okay, so what's our turn 2 play? We run 18 lands, so the probability of hitting the second land should be high because we go turn 1 Ragavan pass. Let's say they don't play Young Wolf, they play Halfling. That's good for us because we could force them to block since we don't have a removal spell. So if we force them to block, we're okay, and then we could preordain. So if we bobble first turn, we look at two draws because of bobble. Preordain, we go potentially. So we have a potential of looking at 5 cards deep for the second land drop to hit Spell Pierce, and
Yeah, I mean, I think just to chime in, I think you're assuming that our opponent's gonna block with their halfling, but I feel like in this matchup, like there's a strong chance that they just are like they'll just take one to the chin and they're like, yeah, you don't have that many great hits out of my deck. So I think I would say that's something worth considering where it's like we might already have our second mana like guaranteed.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's almost more concerning. The one hesitation I have with this hand is that because we don't have the answer for the halfling, like things fall apart because we're looking for a second land and a removal spell for a potential halfling, right? That's almost where I'd be more concerned. I think I'm still keeping, knowing the hand's not perfect, but like it's pretty good. I like that we have a counterspell and a Murktide to work towards pretty quickly. Like the Ragavan can either get us some mana towards it or maybe like trade off with something. But I mean, there is a concern there. But yeah, I agree that if I were the Yawg player, I probably would not be blocking. Because if you're attacking with Ragavan and offering the trade, it like almost signals that you don't have a removal spell. And then I'd be like, all right, I'm untapping with Halfling, and I'm going to play a Grist and plus it, and then what are you going to do with this Ragavan? Right?
Yeah, I think
that's probably
Yeah,
that's what's so annoying about Halfling is like the old mana dorks. Like I half the time I wouldn't even care, but the new like Halfling, you just have to care about it. All right, let's do another hand. All right, let's say you're on the draw this time.
No, I'll let you start this one off.
You can take a second.
Yeah, I like it because it deals with their turn 1 mana dorks, and then we're able to do the bobble trick also. But I probably wouldn't do the bobble trick mostly because of Bowmasters, especially on the draw. But if we are on the play, I would do the bobble trick. But you mentioned that this is on the draw, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. On the
Oh, and
draw,
I guess on the draw you have to say so. First, keep mulligan, and then like it totally
Yeah.
depends what they do. If they play a halfling, you're gonna kill it. If they don't
Yeah.
play a halfling, are you gonna preordain, bobble? Like, say they don't play a halfling, they play
Yeah,
a
I
young
think
wolf.
for the I would keep this because we have preordain to help us dig for something. Spell Pierce is helpful against Cauldron, and then Cord also it helps against Cord. We have Unholy Heat. It's borderline. I wouldn't say it's a snap keep. I would think about it.
So
Um,
I'm just gonna ask. So you're keeping. What's your plan though? They play a young wolf turn 1, right? So now your play is not forced. You have tons of options. You're thinking through like, am I gonna preordain because I'm afraid of like bowmasters making the preordain worse? But then you're also thinking like, I have this spell pierce. This could be my best chance to like tag a cauldron because they played young wolf turn 1. Like maybe I just wanna like go fetch land pass, right? Like, what are you
mhm.
thinking?
No, yeah, especially on the draw. If they go turn 1 Young Wolf, um, I would probably. I think I would still keep this hand because we could keep up Cauldron. We could still keep up Unholy Heat.
So
And
you're
then we
not
go
gonna
to
preordain turn 1.
Preordain turn 1. Nah, I don't think so. Mostly because I just don't want to get got by Cauldron because it just
Okay.
escalates the game so quickly. Um,
Yeah, that's fair.
and yeah,
I think that's the key decision here.
yeah, it kind of just feels like keeping up spell pierce for Cauldron mostly. And also you might maybe you play an island turn 1 here too, just to be like cheeky about it. Um, but I don't know. It might just still be a flood strike because you kind of still want to keep your bobble, but then if they play druids to do like the bobble trick for the fetch land, but if they end up playing their mana dorks, it's kind of pointless at that because you kind of want to fetch Unholy Heat.
Mm-hmm.
And then also considering the Surveil land, I actually like this hand because of the Surveil land too. So we could dig a little deeper with it.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if they don't do anything. If they play a wall of roots, then it's like okay, cool. But if they don't play anything, they're signaling Bowmaster for sure. So it's pretty good just to bait them, kill it with Unholy Heat um, on our turn, and then we could go turn 3. We could go Preordain, keep up spell pierce. So then we would have 1 mana left.
Yeah, I mean a lot
So,
a lot
yeah.
changes by turn 3. So, but
Yeah,
okay. So I'm
exactly.
hearing hold up. So, all right, Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I'm keeping this hand as well. I think the way I'm playing it out though is pretty significantly different. I don't think you can get away with playing in fear of Cauldron because I think as soon as you do that, you're kind of like it's almost like a soft concession. I feel like, because you just get so punished by like turn 2 Wall of Roots or like turn 2 second Wolf plus Mana Dork. Like it feels like there's more draws that punish you for holding up the Pierce on 1, versus just. I think I would start probably by bobbling myself, and if I like the card on top, I'm gonna play the island and preordain. Otherwise, I'm going to do the probably fetch shock and then preordain. I just want to get these all these cards that say draw card out of my hand as quick as I can when I'm playing against the Bowmasters deck. I don't want those to be rotting in my hand, kind of as we move to the mid game where we get pretty severely punished by that. And I think I want to hold on to this heat to try and answer like a grist or a halfling instead of like a Bowmasters, because I think most of the time, if as soon as you find like a shredder, you can kind of, or like a delirious DRC, you can invalidate the pressure that Bowmasters really puts on pretty well. So that's kind of, I think that's how I would play it. I do think the Surveilland's quite interesting with this hand. It definitely makes it better, but I'm kind of curious to exactly how I would play with it. I have 0 reps on the card as you know it's not out yet, but
Yeah.
I am interested because I think it kind of changes the texture of the gameplay that this type of hand produces.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think this hand is really, really tricky, and I hear both sides of the argument of like, don't play afraid of Cauldron, but also like when I already have the spell Pierce, it's like so tempting to try to just avoid like almost instantly losing, right? Like if the Cauldron hits the play game one and resolves, I do think that it's like pretty safe to say. What would you put your win rate at, Ben? Like if they stick a Cauldron turn two, like I'm putting myself at like 20% maybe.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm going that. I might put myself at like 45.
45? You're crazy.
Yeah,
You're crazy.
I don't think that
You're crazy.
I think you guys are being far too pessimistic about this matchup. It's not like Cauldron is very, very good, but you can only activate it once a turn. Like if they're trying, like I know like the argument Max you put out earlier was like, well, they can start eating your graveyard, but then it's like, oh, if they're eating my graveyard, that means they're not like doing like basically what they want to be doing with that card in their deck, and it's like, I don't know. I'm not like terrified of that card as I think like a lot of people are.
You can never kill them. They just make your Murktide small, they take away your Delirium, and then as soon as they put one Grist under it, they just go crazy.
Yeah,
I think I don't know. It maybe on like turn 6 or something. If that's the scenario, it's like maybe something went wrong along the ways. But I feel like there's a lot of play to it. I'll also say I know we're not into post board games yet, but I think that there's like some really strong sideboard cards that aren't necessarily in this list, but that the Murktide deck has access to that can kind of help sway, especially the Cauldron battle.
Okay, well I'll add one thought on this hand because I've been thinking about it as you guys have, and then we can talk about Cursed Totem, if that's what you want to talk about, or if there's something else. But
that was not the card.
Not the card. All right, well then we'll see what you have to say. How I would approach this hand is start by bobbling myself, and what I'm thinking about is like, all right, if there's a removal spell or something that makes Bowmaster a little bit more reasonable to deal with, then I'm leaning more towards holding up the spell Pierce, because in my personal opinion, I think if they resolve a turn 2 Cauldron game 1, I think it's really bad for us. Like, I just don't really see a very reliable plan forward to actually kill them before they get to that mid game where they can kind of just like outgrind us, and our counter spells are very ineffective once Cauldron's in play. So I'm probably gonna want to respect the Cauldron here, but then following the bobble, I'm either like fetch shocking or drawing the card with the bobble, and then maybe fetching the Surveil Land if I don't Cauldron. So I think the Surveil Land actually helps, because if they play a Wall of Roots or a Bowmaster, at least we can get a little bit of value to further our plan and try to like then start to pick up the pieces. I think if they play a Wall of Roots, it's like not that as devastating as it seems. Like we kind of being able to get the Surveil Land means we didn't fully float our mana, and then we can just preordain the following turn, and I don't think that's that bad for us. So I think that's how I play it. I think without the Surveil Land, you're like more pressured into the preordain because you really don't want to float your mana. But there's another point where like the Surveil Land kind of really does change how you can play things. Maybe I'm coping and like tricking myself, like is Surveil 1 like really worth it? That's how I would approach it. But I really think Soul Cauldron turn 2 is crushing. Like later in the game, the Soul Cauldron can be less crushing because there's board states where you're like really far ahead. Maybe they just don't have a Yawgmoth or a Grist or whatever is best there. But turn 2 Soul Cauldron, when it gets to hit your yard, slow you down, and then turn on their stuff, I think is really tough. All right, now Ben, what card am I missing? What is the secret card that I need?
It's an oldie but a goodie. Let me tell you that much. Okay. You used to see a lot of this card in Murktide sideboards, not so much anymore. It's Unlicensed Hearse.
Unlicensed Hearse is the secret to the Yawgmoth matchup.
I don't know if it's necessarily the secret, but let me just tell you, Soul Cauldron gets a lot less scary when you have one of these in play. You kind of invalidate a lot of their premium targets. The timing, you can mess with kind of their stuff, and if they're like I said, it makes a kind of a unique like going back and forth game between this Hearse and the Cauldron. But they have, if they're boarding in Force of Vigor against me, I'm calling that a win in my side, and like
No, they're
I
not doing that. Yeah.
I don't mind bringing in Cast the Fire. Like I enjoy casting the fire in the matchup. So I think like post board this actually becomes a very very potent card in the matchup. Also helps deal with kind of the stickier threats, the Undyers, whatever. And it's just like it's a good alternate threat that gets around kind of endurance, just by getting big throughout the mid game, and then maybe they endurance you and they like make it awkward for your Murktide, but then you just play a DRC and you crew it and swing for like 8 or something. And so I think there's a lot of merit to this card in the matchup.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I always go back and forth on it. I think that, and I have talked with some Yawg players about how scared they are of her. So I get mixed results. Some people say they think it's like, oh yeah, this card. I mean, it can invalidate Soul Cauldron depending on which one comes down first. Like if the Hearst comes first, then the Soul Cauldron's gonna be pretty much a brick. If the Hearst comes second, then it kind of might not be as effective, which is not ideal. But it's like a one turn swing. It can make things. You just have to plan for that a little bit, but there is definitely some merit to it. I mean, you can stop a yawgmoth, I guess. They don't really play Strangleroot anymore, so less undying creatures that you're cleaning up with a Hearse. And then the attacking portion of it, I also am not 100% sold on, just because like they have a lot of ground creatures that can block. I'm not even sure what you're crewing with, because you cut Ragavan, and I would like to attack with my Ledger Shredder and Murktide, but can come up, I guess, potentially. So, Noe, any thoughts? Or I guess Ben first, you can respond if you had anything that I said that you don't fully agree with, and then Noe can weigh in.
I would kind of put the only pushback I'd really have on what you said is, I guess one, I think having the Ledger Shredders in the main deck as well makes it much more crewable. And
Okay.
it allows you to not like feel forced to, especially with 19 lands, you can kind of get away with discarding more lands than you otherwise would, because sometimes I know you feel like this Shredder needs to get bigger faster. So that'd probably be my first pushback. And then the other pushback I'd have is, you said that it's kind of dependent on the timing of which comes down first. And yeah, if you're playing Hearse after your opponent's had like a Cauldron in play for like 6 turns, it's probably not doing too much. But I think if you get them like a 1-turn window, they really get 1 activation out of it, and then I think Hearse pretty much invalidates further activations, as you can kind of like just hold up the activation for when they go for it, or make the timing of it awkward. And
right, I mean, they have to do it on your end step. They need to have like 3 payoffs in the yard, basically, because they need to do it on your end step. Then you respond by activating Hearse, targeting their 2 best cards in the graveyard, and then your Hearse is tapped for them to untap and do the Cauldron. So it's not like perfect, but it often will be able to control their yard in a way that makes their Soul Cauldron a lot less scary. So I definitely, I mean, yeah, I see some merit to it. I'll probably personally be testing that more, because I think Hearse is already, a great card to have in the mirror. I didn't think it had very much application beyond that, so I wasn't going to play one. But if I think that it can come in against Yawgmoth and be like a 7 or 8, then I would be interested. Noe, what do you think?
So, my love-hate relationship with unlicensed Hearse is pretty strong, mostly because if you have it exactly turn 2 or turn 3, I would push turn 4. It's phenomenal. Like it's good, it's great, especially in the early turns. So I if I was playing unlicensed Hearse, I would probably want 2 copies, just so that way I could likely see it. But if I'm having it as like a one of, I'm not too happy about it. Because like if you get to the mid game, it's just like a mopey two drop artifact that doesn't really do much, as mentioned about Soul Cauldron eating it up already. So it kind of depends on the numbers. If you run 2, I would bring them in for sure. Curse Totem, well, we'll go to that later, but yeah,
let's do it now. We gotta keep this thing moving to the next matchup, but let's do like a 30-second yes, no, and why for Cursed Totem. What do you think?
Yes, I think Cursed Home is pretty good because it does shut off their dork. Like it shuts off their dorks. It shuts off yawgmoth. It shuts off a lot of things, and they have exactly Pusejus to deal with it,
Mm-hmm.
and a Thoughtseize. So and Thoughtseizes. So I would personally probably board one in if I had it in the sideboard for sure. It just stops their whole deck basically.
Okay, Ben.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with it. I just think that between hearse and the totem, I'd probably decide with the hearse, as I think it's a little bit more versatile against the meta versus just like having a specific silver bullet for Yogg.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's both fair points. The totem does also hit hardened scales, which
Yeah.
is maybe like a 7th or 8th most popular deck in the meta right now, but a little bit less popular, but couldn't maybe see it. But yeah, I think the hearse hitting the mirror is also important. All right, I appreciate both of you guys talking about this matchup. I think I won't have a nightmare about Yawgmoth tonight or Soul Cauldron. No promises though. But I guess I hope everyone feels more comfortable after talking through kind of the different dynamics of the matchup. Thank you guys both. Now let's move on to what's next. We got Scam. So B-Fizz and Charles. Maybe B-Fizz, you can introduce yourself first, and then Charles.
B-Fizz, in Southern California. I came back to playing Magic maybe like, I don't know, a year and a half ago. Started with Modern. It was always my favorite format. Joined Merc Guides. Queued for 2 RCs with Murktide, and yeah.
All right. Charles?
Hey, my name is Charles. I'm from Montreal. I used to be a Dead Shadow player like Noe, and one of my friends pushed me on to play Murktide, and I joined your Patreon. I think your Patreon has been created like 1 year already, yeah, and I learned a lot from it. I got actually my first invite with Scam, but I redeemed myself in Toronto with just Murktide with the additional in the sideboard.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty cool tech.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's it.
Very cool. Very cool. Sorry, that was safer. All right, let's talk about the Scam matchup. So, I guess I'm not sure you'd even call it Scam fully anymore. It's kind of red black mid range. They're not doing as much of the scamming. Now that Fury is banned, but I guess what do you guys kind of start big? What are you thinking about in this matchup? Is it a racing matchup? Is it a grinding matchup? Is it a, what do you think? Maybe Charles first.
Okay, sure. I think it's more a grindy matchup for sure. Definitely look like if I was playing. It looked like if I was playing a John basically. Before it used to be. It depends also if they have the grief scam. If they have the grief scam, turn one can be a nightmare. But
yeah, do you think? I guess B-Fizz, what do you think?
Yeah, generally it's a matchup that we win with iteration, I think, because it goes for resources, but there's always that asterisk of turn one grief, right? That's kind of like I always feel good, and unless maybe they have a grief, but even then it's like you can still win. I definitely feel like this is one of probably the funnest matchup of the ones we're going to talk about.
Especially because it's open deck league, I think we're looking at least for like a 1 or 2 removal in our opening hand. If
bolts.
Yeah, I think just like talking about mulligans in this matchup in general, like the risk of ruin can be so high if you ship hands because of those grief hands. So I think I'm a lot more inclined to keep hands that like I usually wouldn't, just because a lot of times we're like, oh well, if they grief us, it's really bad. It's like, well, what are the chances of a 6-card hand that we get griefed being really good?
Mhm.
That doesn't happen very often. So I think, yeah, you always have to keep that in mind.
Also, what the key in the matchup, I think it's what you said is like all that mana, because they have to basically to respect it. Otherwise, we can punish them if they try to evoke a grief. We can punish them by either unholy or spell pierce the undying effect.
Yeah, or just start scolding.
Yeah. Also, all
Yeah,
that.
I think
When
like
you have DRC. Oh yeah.
some people might like not want to keep a hand if you don't have like bolts and stuff because you can't kill a scammed grief. But it's like, remember, you can also just draw the bolts. Like, it's probably better to just have more raw resources because over the course of the whole game, you're probably gonna win if you're playing on that aspect because you have iteration and they don't. So yeah, I think you can be a lot more liberal with your keeps in this matchup. I used to like really aggressively like mulligan for subtlety, but it's like, well, then I lose a bunch of cards if I do that anyway. So.
Yeah, sure. And I think kind of what I'm hearing is that it's a resource battle. But if you had to pick someone who's the aggressor versus the defender, do you think that we're trying to play more aggressive, or what is a game that we win? Kind of.
Oh no, we win the long game, I think.
Yeah, exactly. One the game.
Okay, so that means by default, Scam is the aggressive deck. So
yeah, and they have the
on the
most
play.
aggressive start when they actually scam. Like our 2 roads to victory are iteration or Murktide backed up to counter their terminate. Like those are the 2 ways we win most often.
Yeah, I agree with those.
yeah,
I think that the nightmare or like can do is like turn 1 grief and turn 2 dash ragavan or attack us for 6 and you have like
yeah. I think that turn 1 Scam Grief followed by any turn like 2 drop on turn 2 is a disaster if we don't have like a hand that has like 3 removal spells or something. So those can always happen.
Yeah, you just have to be okay with losing.
On the draw, those can happen.
Yeah.
I think that I kind of mirror your guys's like instinct of you want to keep most hands, but I think on the draw is where I do get a little bit more picky, knowing that even down a card on the draw, you can still often kind of outgrind them. So if I do see a hand that's like 3 lands, like a spell pierce, a Ragavan, a counterspell, and a Murktide, I might mulligan it because I think like, all right, this Ragavan's not going to do a lot for me. They could have just have Bowmaster, but also like they could just have a push or another removal spell, and I'm more worried about holding off their attack, right? So in my mind, I'm thinking like this hand is already kind of a mulligan on the draw, and it's not a very strong 6 either because we have no removal spells. So like some of the time they won't grief you, right? And there's times when they don't grief you, having that first removal spell can take off a lot of the pressure. I think on 6 you're gonna like keep everything basically, but on 7 on the draw, I think that I would like warn. I think an easy way to lose is to keep a hand with like counterspell, Ledger Shredder, Murktide, Ragavan, and a couple lands, and like get confused that like these creatures are gonna do something when in reality they're just gonna like run you over with their offense first. Keeping in mind that we win the long game, right? So balancing that is tricky. I mean, do you agree or disagree? I guess beef is maybe. Do you disagree?
No, I think that iteration is so good that we're fine mulling once on the draw. I think that's totally reasonable.
Okay, yeah. That's kind of where I'm at. Iteration's another card where it's like you think it's so good in the matchup. I often see a lot of hands on the draw where it's like Murktide, Iteration, Shredder, Bauble. What's that? 4 cards and like 3 lands. And you're like, oh, you're so tempted by this hand. Maybe you can keep it. It's so tempting, right? But like imagine they grief scam you. It's horrible. That's true with a lot of decks, but imagine even they just go turn 1 Ragavan, you're like already under pressure, or they like thought sees you and like I don't even know what they take out of that hand.
So
and then they follow up with a 2-drop and a 3-drop. It can get dicey, you know.
The hand you're describing there is really like 4 lands, a bad 2-drop, and then 2 like 4-drops. is the thing.
Right.
Because like
Yeah,
you're
you
not
have
playing
to
your
remember
iteration or Murktide
Murktide
until
and
later.
iteration are not 2-drops really. So
Yeah, and I also don't want to Murktide if I can't protect it because like they always have stupid terminate. So and like you can just win in 2 turns if you protect that Murktide. So like it's very valuable to play your Murktide correctly. I feel like this is all game 1, of course, before Leyline of the Void, which I think is the real discussion
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
matchup is Leyline of the Void.
okay, so I think we've got a grasp on game 1. Now let's talk post board. How are we sideboarding? Elephant in the room is like you're gonna see most scam lists have like 3
Yeah.
Leyline of the Voids, which are gonna come in against you. What do you think? Maybe Charles start us off.
Yeah, I think it's definitely when you're gonna look at opponent deck, it's definitely the thing you're gonna look if they have a couple of leyline. If they have a couple of leyline, I like to take out my DRC.
Okay, DRC.
And yeah, and got depend how many cards you bring in. Sometimes I used to cut 1 Murktide.
Oh wow. Okay.
I mean that's what you do. So
Is that like down to 2 Murktides, or like is that only if you have 4? I'm pretty surprised by that, just because we did just talk about Murktide being one of the best cards. So I'm usually more willing to risk the Leyline of the Void when it comes to Murktide Regent than I am with DRC, because like DRC is good, but it's not as backbreaking as Murktide is into their strategy. Is kind of the way I see it. So like one's worth the opportunity cost versus the other.
Yeah. Better. What's cool?
You like Spell Pierce?
I call
This is an interesting one.
Yeah, well, it's good against Fable. Good again.
Yeah, they do play Fable now.
Yeah. Maybe.
Well, what cards do you want to bring in? I guess that's a question.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe we don't.
Yeah,
need to cover
Yeah,
that.
that's a big part of it.
Brotherhood. I mean, if they have Leyline or not.
They have Leyline.
Okay, yeah, Brotherhood and.
If they don't have Leyline, we're winning anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Salty. Bread and Bar, Stone Scolding. I think that's it.
Yeah, seems reasonable. All right, so we need to cut 2 more cards besides the DRCs. B-Fizz, do you have any weigh in? You want to weigh in?
So yeah, so because you have the Brotherhoods in, then it's fine to cut the Pierce. Like really, we're never gonna tag a Terminate with a Pierce. I mean, like, it's not likely that we're gonna do that. And then since we have the Brotherhoods in against Fable, it makes the Pierce, I mean, pretty much dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think if I understand what you're saying is like you feel Brotherhood's End helps us clean up Fable.
Yeah, because the only reason we would...
It gives us more removal to kind of like make sure that Fable's not going to bury us in value, and you think that Pierce is like a little bit more situational, and so you're fine cutting it.
Yeah, it's like, of course Fable's always great. That's why, like, if we have it, we'd bring it in the mirror.
Yeah.
But the only other thing that I can realistically see hitting is like Odawaring their Leyline and then piercing it on the way down. Like, it's not really going to hit a lot of stuff in their deck. Unless I'm forgetting something. But yeah, and so since we have the Brotherhoods in to deal with the exact same card that Pierce would be dealing with, plus Brotherhoods in, you know, can clean up Bowmaster's stuff. I mean, it can clear up their whole board, really. I think we don't need the Pierce at that point. And I also like cutting the DRC for the same reason that you said, where if they don't have the Leyline of the Void, then Murktide is just like S tier, and we're super happy to have it. Also, I think Ben might have left, but if you had Unlicensed Hearse, that's pretty good against Leyline too.
Yeah.
You like Unlicensed Hearse against Scam.
Yeah, like anytime I mention it, people are always like, well, you don't get to hit their grief on turn 1. I'm like, yeah, dude, I'm worried about Leyline. Because, like, you know, when they lost Fury, we lost Fury too. Yeah. And that's, like, a pretty big cost. Because I felt great having 2 Subtlety and 2 Fury against Leyline, but we don't have that anymore. So, like, any opportunity to have any card
You're
that's
saying
good against Leyline.
Is a good threat? Why is it good against Leyline?
Oh, because we don't care that our graveyard is exiled. It's just anything that can... I just want... Like, if they have a Leyline of the Void out, and I just want anything that can win the game.
Okay, so you're saying you like curse because it can like maybe get big and then hit them for 10.
Yeah, and of course it does shut off like they're not dead after alls and
Yeah,
stuff
no, I
like
mean
that. So
that's
like
relevant.
it's like a bunch of like little half points that add
Sure.
up into it being good in the matchup.
And I question though how scam sideboards. I wouldn't be surprised if I saw a pile of stern scoldings like on the draw. I might just bail on the grief plan, and like cut like griefs and cut my undying spells. Just be like, I'm out of here. Maybe not. I don't know. I mean that's
Yeah, I think they
kind of a
still
question
want.
of
They're
how
still
scam wants to board.
I mean,
they're
I'm
still kind
also
of happy. They're still kind of happy to like not dead after all Bowmaster or something though.
Sure. What do you
But I
think,
think they would
Charles?
keep some in.
Yeah.
When I was playing Scam against Murktide, I used to cut a couple of Tulsi because you just want to be
Okay. Interesting.
grindable. Well, that's what Young Beagle said.
Yeah.
You would
Yeah.
look for the like Leyline, shoulder, key command, like that.
Yeah, no, you just said Leyline and Shieldred. I mean, that's like a a 1-2 punch that can actually be pretty brutal. Like Shieldred is either their scariest card or their least scary card, because if they have Leyline in play, like our Unholy Heat can't kill it.
Yeah.
It's gonna take 2 removal spells. It's gonna get them some value for sure. It's also hard to race. Like we'd have to already have played an 8/8 Murktide they can't answer or something. But yeah, with Leyline in play, Shieldred's a problem, and like to the point where I am actively thinking about that as I'm like crafting my game plan. Like, can I afford to hold on to this counter spell any longer, just to close the door on Shieldred? It's always a risk reward evaluation, right? Like maybe you want to counterspell something, but like, can you afford not to? Right? Just because counterspell is like the one clean answer we really have to Shieldred. When they have Leyline in play. If Leyline's not in play, Shieldred becomes a lot less scary because you've got 4 Unholy Heats that can play towards it. I guess I'd prioritize using my bolts maybe just to like save the Unholy Heat for Shieldred. Kind of depends on the situation because bolt could go face and race, but that is one thing to call out. I think that's smart of you to call out, Charles. Is like Shieldred, especially with Leyline in play. If that's what you were saying, is like it can be scary.
Yeah. When the best timing to kill a creature?
Yeah, when's the best timing to kill a creature? With the Undying spells that they have,
Yeah, exactly.
you always have to keep that in mind. What do you think, Beefiz?
Well, hopefully they're tapped out, and that's when we're going for it.
Yeah, and I think often you can kind of sense, like,
Yeah.
do you agree? You can kind of sense when they might have an Undying spell or something reactive.
Yeah, if they've had 2 cards in hand for like 4 turns in a row and done nothing, it's like, all right, well, we know they have that, and I mean, what else could they have,
Like
really?
push, maybe.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, I guess if we have nothing out, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think.
I think it's also. Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
You go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think it's also worth mentioning that, like, we used to always take out Ragavan in this matchup. Now we're kind of forced to leave it in because we don't have as many threats that don't care about Leyline.
Yeah.
But I've found I was playing. Skura got to me, and I was playing Teamer for a minute, and in his list he had, I think it was like 3 Stern Scoldings and 2 Spell Snares, some like large amount of those 1-mana counter spells. Having a lot of those cards really made it very easy to keep Ragavan in that matchup and make it very good. Just you're only dashing it when you have like those 1-mana counter spells up for Bowmaster, and you just never get your Ragavan tagged by Bowmaster.
Yep.
And I felt like it really made it really changed my view of that card in that matchup. So that's why I do like having like 1 Spell Snare in the board a lot of times.
I also think that like just simply they don't have a lot of answers to Ragavan turn 1 on the play. So I think on the play it's like especially exceptional. On the draw it's like it does get a little bit more dicey, but you just need to play your game to not let Bowmasters hit the battlefield, like protect it with a Stern Scolding. Don't waste your Stern Scolding on a Dothy if you can bolt the Dothy and then Stern Scolding a Bowmaster. Then the Ragavan will just trade 1 for 1 with a Fatal Push, which is like not that bad, or it has the upside of like actually starting to connect and get value. So, but on the play they only have 4 Fatal Push to answer the Ragavan, so they're like a lot of the time I play a Ragavan turn 1 on the play and they like Thought Seize me, or play their own Ragavan, and then I just like kill it, hit them with my Ragavan. The mana is valuable in the matchup because of how good Expressive Iteration is. Like, it just makes it that much better. Opens up lines like early Murktide and Counterspell, Shredder double spell, lots of stuff. So Ragavan is, I think, like, if you see Leyline of the Void, I like keeping my Ragavans in. I think if you don't see Leyline of the Void, they're like some lists with Hearse. It gets a little weird. I'm not.
Well, if they don't have Leyline, then we're just keeping the DRCs, right?
Yeah. Do you keep all Shredder if they don't have Leyline?
That's a question. I think maybe Shredder could be the cut if they don't have Leyline.
Yeah.
I think that could be
that's
part
fair.
that's more like it's a really good pivot against Leyline, but if it's not helping you like dodge graveyard hate, I think Shredder is not the strongest because their removal spell is for Fatal Push, not Lightning Bolts.
I've seen some bolts,
to
but
this
I don't
day
know.
surprises me because I think that Scam is like secretly an aggro deck, so I'm really surprised that they play Fatal Push. But I guess they're just like if they find it important to like hit Yawgmoth and maybe like Dryad. But I think if I were building Scam, I might play Lightning Bolts. But I'm ill informed. But I see a lot of Fatal Pushes. So Shredder's not super resilient to their removal, and sometimes in top deck wars it can be like harder to trigger, like you're just like top decking Iteration or Preordain, otherwise you're just going 1-for-1 a lot off the top. So
yeah, it's hard to play Shredder because it's kind of the same thing that I was talking about with Ragavan, but kind of tougher because it's like, all right, then I want to play Shredder when I can trigger it that turn and also counter Bowmasters. Like, that's a lot to ask.
yeah. All right, let's do a couple sample hands. Start with some on the draw. I think this. Yeah, what do you guys think about this hand?
I think it's a key.
Why?
We have,
Yeah.
we have a removal, we have Expressive Iteration, where Spell Pierce can be good against Fable or Spell Seed, whatever.
Okay, Beef is.
Yeah, we have Iteration. This is pre-board, so our DRC is obviously a lot better. Yeah, there's just too many cards that do things for me to ship this back in this matchup.
Yeah, it's
also,
like kind of. Oh, go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, before we're playing the DRC, I will actually wait like a wolf turn to get Delirium first because I just don't want my DRC die instantly to Bowmasters.
It's a fair distinction. So you're keeping the hand, but you're not going to play the DRC on the draw at least. Maybe on the play, does that change?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in order to change it.
On the play, maybe you do play the DRC. It's like, how close are you to Delirium is kind of the question.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not super close, but also you're not in a rush to play DRC.
Yeah, exactly.
So I might just wait either way to make sure you avoid that blowout play of them having the Bowmasters. It's not a blowout, but it's like a 2.5 for 1 because then you have to also kill the Bowmasters. They have a 1/1. Like, it's just not great. But yeah, I mean, I like this hand. I think that it's hard to mulligan. A lot of the games get really scrappy, and you're not going to get run over, which is basically like my major red flag in this matchup is like, does this hand get run over? So I'd keep this as well. Would you keep this? This is an example of like, it's a borderline hand where like if you're up against a Thoughtseize deck, do you really want to mulligan?
I think this one's bad enough to ship back.
And what are you looking for in a 6? Like, how wide of a range of 6s do you think are better than this? Like,
if we had like 2 lands and all spells, I'd rather have that. Because like the Spell Pierce is already not very good against them, so it's like, ugh.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel that. I agree. I think like mulliganing to a 6 with 2 lands and like 4 spells is probably better than this.
Yeah.
4 lands
I think
already is like not a good feeling against the Thoughtseize deck because you'll just like start to flood. So
Yeah, I think on that other hand, when you guys were talking about if you play your DRC or not, this matchup I'm only playing it if I have Delirium. I think.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, fair.
Like just hoping that you're gonna get Delirium before the Bowmaster. I don't really want to risk it because we're already like planning to most of the time win on an axis of like card advantage, so I don't. I want to really play to try to win that way, and then if we get to sneak out of not Bowmaster, Murktide win, then that's just like icing on the cake.
Sure. How about this one? Say you're on the, I think on the play, to me, this is like a clearer keep, but on the draw.
Oh, is it the temple's supposed to be the Scryland?
It's
Huh?
it's the new Scryland.
They keep giving us these spell pierces.
Yeah.
It's bugged.
Can we beat turn 1 grief?
Well, I mean, what are they
yeah,
going to
just
take?
draw
What,
bolt.
what are they going to take? What are they going to take with a turn 1 grief?
I think they're probably taking both preordained so that the grief stays alive, and they just went off
And
that.
you play the Surveil land, and you are a turn away from a Murktide, or maybe a fetch.
1, 2, 3,
Maybe not
4,
exactly.
5.
You're close-ish.
I mean, we're still kind of a ways away from Murktide, right?
I usually don't ask, like, can we beat turn 1 grief scam, because, like, turn 1 grief scam is always just going to come down to, like, how well you can top deck, right?
Yeah.
Like, they're always going to take your removal spells. There's, like, very few hands we have on the draw that, like, can, because we just have, like, a subtlety or two, basically.
Yeah.
But, like, the other range of their hands, like, on the draw, they have a Ragavan turn 1, it's bad. We're hoping they, like, Thought Seize us turn 1.
This actually brings up a good point about the Scryland, is, like, I feel like the cost of a tap land in this deck is, like, very high.
Well, this replaced
like,
a
imagine
spell.
if that was a
keep
steep
in
dance.
mind, it replaced a spell, not a untapped land.
Oh, okay.
So we're on 19 lands. So if I weren't playing the tapped land, this would have been considered...
Say a bolt.
Or, well, I already have 4 bolts, but...
oh, you're for sure set on
this
the
would have been like
bolt.
a consider or a stern scolding. I don't think that would have really made the hand better. Probably worse, but...
Yeah, I mean, I guess it just changes what we're looking for with our preordain at that point. Because, like, the hand as it is, if we're on the draw, I think we keep it, and then we're preordaining on 1 to aggressively look for a removal spell. Unless they... Yeah, if they Ragavan, it's pretty rough, because we can't block with a DRC.
It's a close one. I think it's a close one. And also, like, if this is pre-board, so you know the Murktide is going to be good if they don't, like, discard it. Post-board, it's, like, easier to send this back under, like, risk of Leyline, for sure. Well, you're not going to have the DRC, but even if it's, like, a Ragavan instead of a DRC, like, maybe you want to send this back for risk of Leyline, but...
I guess one interesting thing is if they play a Ragavan on 1 and we preordain looking for whatever...
We can, like, brick it, but they get the treasure.
Well...
Yeah, they can.
Thing is, turn 2, they can Fable, so like, do we have to keep open the Spell Pierce?
Yeah. Well, I don't think you can afford to keep open Spell Pierce, honestly.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
No, turn 1 Ragavan gets super punishes this hand for sure.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a
Everything
question
else
of
is
like
pretty
how much
okay.
you're willing to risk. This hand, I mean, maybe the argument is this hand's too slow. Like it's too.
Yeah, I think
clunky.
it might be slow.
Well, I mean, they might just not have a Ragavan. Like every other hand they can have, our hand's pretty decent, right?
Yeah, let's screenshot this one. Let's.
Yeah, I think
this is an interesting one. I'm gonna go to Twitter with maybe. We'll see.
Yeah.
I think we really only care if they have a Ragavan, and like I think we can just probably take that risk because like, hand's pretty fine besides that.
Yeah. Okay, now let's do post-board. So we're going to bring in these, bring out these. They're on Leyline and the Voids. Let's do a couple hands. All right, hand number 1.
Play or do?
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think we're keeping this either way.
Yeah, that's a keep.
Yeah. All right.
What do you think about the Borrower? Like that's a card that we haven't played in a while, right? And then it kind of, I've been seeing it like a lot of lists had it in Ghent.
Yeah.
And like, what do you think about Borrower against these Bowmaster decks? At first, I was like, oh, it dies the Bowmaster, but then I had that experience of like playing the Ragavans with all the Stern Scoldings, and I was like, oh, I can just play the Borrower out in the same manner.
I think that the second is the better approach, right? Like, first of
Yeah,
all,
yeah.
Borrower, a lot of its value is just being another point of interaction to slow down their onslaught. So, like, if they do grief scam you, like, you could even Borrower the grief. I know it's kind of like awkward to give it back to them, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do, right?
Yeah.
But also just being able to bounce like a Fable token can get you value, and then the flip side, the 3/1, like, Bowmaster is just a card that you want to counter always, right? And it's just like, I don't want to sideboard in fear of that card as much as I think I have in the past, especially now that we're like up to 3 Stern Scolding. I think you can sideboard like in less fear of the card, and it's more important to shape your play in the game around trying to not get blown out by it. So I'm not gonna cut Borrower in the matchup because of Bowmaster, but I am gonna not like flash Bowmaster in nakedly when they could just have a Bowmaster, flash Borrower in naked when they could just have a Bowmaster for it. Usually, I mean, sometimes you just have to take the risk, right? Like, you can have a read that they don't have Bowmaster because maybe it's a top deck war or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it is context dependent, but like, that's kind of how I see it now.
I don't know if I agree with we always want to counter Bowmaster, because like a lot of times you'd rather just kill it with a removal spell and save a counter for grief or something.
In this matchup, the tricky thing is that it's like hard to do that without a clear path forward, is I guess what I would say. So if I have Counterspell and Murktide in my hand, and they play a Bowmaster, then I'm working towards Murktide, hold up Counterspell, counter your Terminate, you lose. In that situation, I 100% agree with you. But if you're not working towards that specifically, like if you have a Stern Scolding, I think I'm more interested in stopping the Bowmaster now, because Bowmaster then makes like drawing, like I guess if you have a removal spell, all that it does is make drawing Ragavan worse. So it is very context dependent. You're right.
It depends on your read of not dead after
I
all.
hyperbole
Also.
it a little bit where I made it a little.
Yeah.
But often I just feel that it's cleaner to counter the Bowmaster and like line up your removal spells against a Grief or a Dothy. It depends.
There's another card that's kind of hard to play again. It's Proxa.
Yeah, against Proxa, it's just like, I mean, it's you can't really do too much about it. If you have the Hearse, that can be like, you can bring it in, but usually they have one Croxa, and like the best thing to do is just try to race them with a Murktide or other flyers. It's a good card against us for sure, because like it's gonna usually get multiple cards off of us, and the games get grindy, and then like they can just keep escaping it. So your kind of best route is to Murktide them or race them with like a Shredder or something. I think there's not too much more to be said about it though. Like, there's not much you can do. All right, what do you guys think? Let's do one final hand. Keep or mulligan on the play.
On the play, I kind of like it. Those baubles could be anything. And also, like, we have a combination of Murktide, and we can keep it relevant because we have the Borrower.
In case they have Leyline.
Yeah.
Sure. If they do
like
put
like
Leyline into
preordain
play,
in
it's
this
going to be a
hand,
little
but-
awkward. How many baubles we use, or like, are we going to try to save the baubles? We probably just have to fire both of them off.
I think we're being aggressive with the baubles.
Yeah, especially because we don't want to like they Bowmaster us in response to all those baubles.
Yeah, that's another thing that everyone should remember in this matchup is like if you're on the play and don't try to get cute, or I'm sorry, if you're on the draw, don't try to get cute with your baubles. Just like do them on turn 1. Don't get Bowmastered.
Yeah. That's a good point. It's a great point. So I'm also leaning towards keep. Like, this is I think a perfect example of a hand where like in other matchups maybe you're less like in the mirror. Oh, actually, this hand is so good in the mirror too, though. It just has all the right cards for me to want to risk keeping a 1-lander. But like, generally, the rule of Murktide is you don't want to keep 1-landers, right? But against Scam, I think this is a spot where you right, a matchup where you're more willing to like take, all right, you have 3 looks at a land or a preordain. I think I'm gonna risk it, and I'd like use the baubles in my opponent's upkeep so that if I find like a preordain, at least then it's like protected from a thought seize I don't know, or like a grief scam.
You could do one on your turn and one on their upkeep also. And we know 2 cards in their hand.
Yeah, I guess knowing the card in their hand is like somewhat valuable too sometimes. Yeah, I could see that being the case, but yeah, I think this is an example of like when the matchup comes down to resources like this, and you have the bolt to protect you from an immediate threat. You could even miss a land drop for a turn, and it might not be like a massive impact on how the game plays out as long as you hit that second land and like the top 5 cards. So
Yeah.
I feel pretty good about that, and like also preordain gives you redraws. Okay.
I'm kind of
cool.
surprised to hear you say that in general you don't keep a lot of 1-land hands with this deck.
Oh, I'm pretty against it. I think. Sorry, I should say without preordain. I should make that clear.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair.
You're right. You're 100% right. Like preordain plus 1 land, golden a lot of the time, but like bauble plus 1 land, I would not. Like I think it's too risky. Double bauble is kind of funny because it's like a little bit in the middle. You get to see like 2 extra cards, but the fact that
Like
this matchup,
DRC plus bauble.
even DRC plus bauble, I'm like it does depend on the matchup. I think because sometimes it's like it depends how good your hand is for the matchup, right? Like what's the risk and the payoff. You know an open deck list. In closed deck list, I'm like more inclined to mulligan simply because like I don't even know if my cards are gonna line up well game 1, and then post board you get all the context. But yeah. All right, thank you guys for talking through that matchup. I would say one thing is like Brotherhood's End and Stern Scolding feel like the all-stars to me, along with Murktide Region and Expressive Iteration. Like I think that core package of cards is what like really helps keep this matchup favorable. Like these are the heavy hitter closers, and these are the ones that are like, you're not going to be able to run me over consistently. I'm going to like be able to stabilize and even punish you for overplaying sometimes. Like this card has been performed really well for me. Scam is one of the main reasons I have it in my deck, and then Stern Scolding similarly, just being prepared for Scam.
Yeah, I agree with all that.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you guys. All right, and then lastly, we've got Murktide. This has been getting long, and I appreciate everyone who's still watching, but I'll try to make the Murktide section as quick as I can. So for me, similar to Scam, it comes down to a couple key cards, Iteration and Murktide Regent. The game often feels like a lot of trading resources, and the cards that kind of break that parity are Murktide. If it resolves, is not going to trade 1-for-1 with anything. Not to mention it just wins really quickly. And then Iteration is going to resolve and also give you a 2-for-1 to pull ahead. The way I see it, I think that Ragavan and DRC are not the greatest because your opponent's going to have so many removal spells, so it's going to be a 1-for-1 trade, and the cards themselves don't really work you towards a Murktide or Expressive Iteration, and they don't help prevent your opponents from executing Murktide or Expressive Iteration. So for that reason, I guess what I'm looking to sideboard is usually definitely the Brazen Borrower. I'd probably be looking to bring in these Fluster Storms. The sideboard is not the most prepared for Murktide. I think Subtlety is pretty defensible because you go into long games and it can just like be a good answer to a Murktide Regent. I think these 4 cards are probably the cards I'm most inclined to. If I see like multiple unlicensed hearses, I'm probably bringing in Cast into the Fire. Maybe if I just see 1 hearse, I bring in 1 Cast to match it. Can also tag a Ragavan. And then the card I'm like most likely to cut is DRC. The way I see it, the removal spells are important to have because if you don't answer your opponent's creatures, then you're kind of in trouble there. But by taking out your creatures, you can sometimes strand your opponent's removal spells while you're doing something like Preordain or Iteration or Murktide that kind of further your plan of these cards being the ones and Shredder being like a second in command in terms of like sometimes being able to avoid removal. So I don't have the exact sideboard I would love to have for this matchup, but I guess more broadly, my strategy generally tends to be that of like taking away the creatures that'll trade 1-for-1, and then setting myself up for a long game where I can interact and try to stick Murktides and iterations for the win, and stop my opponent's Murktides and iterations. The card that like Stern Scolding is kind of weird. I think the more Shredders you see, the more interested I am in Scolding. But I think that a lot of Murktide players might also cut their DRCs. So there's less creatures to Stern Scolding, so it's still not the greatest. Anything else that I'm missing? Does anyone have any other like key thoughts on this matchup? It's a lot of draw go, so hitting land drops is pretty huge. Often, like the first person who has to start playing stuff from their hand often is the one who gets punished, because then you're tapped out on your opponent's turn and they can do something impactful. So I definitely keep that in mind of trying to keep hands that can set themselves up to be ready to interact and then punish accordingly.
I don't mind shaving a counterspell in this matchup.
Why? Why is that?
I feel like Flusterstorm's a big upgrade for like exchanging mana values there, and it's still just trading 1-for-1, and we want to be trading better than 1-for-1 where we can.
I think that's a fair point. My pushback is that the games go super long, so I often do think that like having the counterspell in the late game can often trump like a Spell Pierce or Flusterstorm. I actually am almost sometimes closer to cutting a Pierce, but it depends. Like if they have Hearse, that's a big card that you want to have Pierce ready for. Like Flusterstorm is nice because it can have some longevity into the late game, whereas Pierce doesn't always have that longevity, but it's a little bit of a balancing act because Pierce is still pretty great overall.
I feel like Counterspell also has the huge upside of countering Murktide Regent.
Yeah, and any answer to Murktide Regent is a good point. Like if your deck has Dress Down, I often will advocate for bringing Dress Down in, just so you can Dress Down in response to their Murktide and then like bolt it or Unholy Heat it. And furthermore, I think that a lot of people are kind of familiar with this, but if you're just picking up the deck, like you definitely want your Murktide to be at least a 7/7 so that your opponent can't Unholy Heat it. That's generally a pretty good heuristic to have in most situations as well. I don't think you really want Force Negation because I see it as like a hard cast only type of matchup where like if you're ever pitch casting Force Negation, it's just never worth it. And so I would stay away from that card as just an overpriced counter spell that's not as flexible. It doesn't even hit Murktide Regent. I think those are kind of the key bullets to hit in Murktide, I guess. I'll double click on DRC real quick, just because I think some people think, all right, well, it trades 1-for-1. What's the real risk, right? My thought is that it's a little bit incoherent in the game plan. It's really strong early on, and coming out of the gates on the play with like a DRC and Ragavan can be really good. But it's not as good of a late game draw, especially when you're like trying to draw into stuff that can help with a Murktide Regent or a Ledger Shredder. If you draw DRC and they draw Shredder or Murktide Regent, you're not really happy in that exchange. So that's generally where I stand on DRC. I know some people like to keep it in. It kind of just depends what cards you have and how you want to sideboard. Like maybe you could keep in a couple DRCs. Maybe the Stern Scolding's not that great if they're low on Shredders. If they're low on Shredders, DRC also does become just like better overall because it's not going to get blocked by a 3/5 or something. And but those are kind of my I think those are my core thoughts on DRC in the matchup. I'm pretty much a fan of taking it out. And in previous iterations where you had more stuff, like Mystical Dispute's pretty common, I would even start to cut into my Ragavans and just really go all in on that control plan of like stop what they're doing, their important stuff, and then slam Murktide, Iteration, Shredder as your stickier threats.
I feel like I win this matchup a lot more on the draw I wonder if that's because it kind of naturally leans towards playing that control plan that you're talking about.
I think that's interesting. I think there's still a lot of advantages to being on the play, especially depending on your
Yeah.
sideboard. Like having a turn one Ragavan into Shredder Bobble is really hard to come back from. Having a turn two Hearse on the play can be really hard to come back from. You can like start to play your iterations earlier. It just kind of depends on how things go, but I think that you're right that the play is not as always as big of an advantage in the Murktide
Yeah,
mode
you're
because things can really slow down. But I think that I wouldn't take the draw is the bottom line.
Yeah, it is interesting though, because like if you're on the play, it seems like a lot of times you're kind of forced to blink first.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. I think that we can wrap up there. I just want to thank everyone again for coming on and sharing how you've been preparing for the RC, how you think about matchups. I think it's super helpful just to get other perspectives. I'm thinking about some stuff like Curse Totem, like Dress Down, just a lot of different cards. Mystical Dispute for the Rhinos matchup, is that important? So gets everyone's brains churning. Thank you to everyone who watched this episode. I hope you guys appreciated it. And yeah, go Merc Guides. Yeah. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and call it there. Thank you, everyone.